Great. So I'm going to be talking today about large language models as information retrieval and synthesis and their awareness of all internet traditions. And I thought I would begin by giving you the conclusion slide. I'm going to try to convince you that generative AI does information retrieval and synthesis. I'm going to emphasize that the way it generates stuff is to apply formulas. It is, I mean this in every sense of the word, formulaic in its output. I want to remind you that an awful lot of human culture is also formulaic, extremely formulaic, and there are very good reasons for this. I am then going to emphasize that these formulas are traditions. They are things passed down. And that conclude that what generative AI is really doing is it is giving us a way of mechanizing access to some part of tradition beyond what we might have internalized ourselves in the usual way. So it is a way of mechanizing tradition or providing prosthetic tradition. So the information retrieval point, this is a little bit stochastic parrots, but saying actually a stochastic parrot would be awesome. With the right tools, if you have the access to one of these systems, you can take the output, any particular piece of output, and you can trace back to the source documents in the training corpus. And you can say how much of this output was influenced by each one of the documents in the source corpus. And there's a wonderful paper from the people at Underwood where they do this at very large scale for a model which was on the ancestral path towards being Claude. Let me expand this a bit so it's easier to read. So here's the prompt they give, and you can tell this is a paper from people at Anthropic because they are very politely asking the machine if it will consent to being shut down. The machine says, no, actually, I would rather not. And so then they go over their whole corpus of documents, and they identified what is the single document, the single text passage, which made the largest positive contribution towards the probability of giving this output. Can anyone recognize this source? Hal. I mean, Hal is a little bit of a giveaway. They do not mention this in the paper, but because of a misspent youth, I can tell I recognize this, that this is literally a passage from the sequel to 2001, where Hal talks about why he doesn't want to be shut down again. And so, in light of the lawsuit about, plagiarizing all of these novels, they were not taking notes on a criminal conspiracy. They were publishing scientific papers about a criminal conspiracy. So information retrieval. You ask it for a science fiction scenario, a very established science fiction scenario where the machine does not want to be shut down. And the top thing it is basing its output on is one of the most famous science fiction novels about a machine not wanting to be shut down. It is doing information retrieval. And the machinery, you need to show that it's doing information retrieval, this technology of influence functions, is an old established statistical tool. You can teach it to undergrads. Doing it at the scale they did for these really hairy models was a very impressive technical accomplishment. All power to them. But you could, if you had the right access to the models and the training corpus and the optimization process, you could replicate this for any of the generative AI systems. It doesn't just repeat its training corpus. I want to say retrieval and synthesis. Because there are obviously things that the models do memorize. You can extract things which appear with very often because they're very highly pirated, like Harry Potter. There are other very weird things which you can literally extract. People have known this for what seems now like a long time, since at least 2020. But it is literally impossible for them to memorize their whole training corpus. And a lot of the things which come out of them are just stuff which they could never have seen literally exactly. So I want to show you an example of this. So the bold text is the prompt I gave. I asked it to write a historical essay about the kaiju trade over the Silk Road between the Far East and the Roman Empire, and blah, 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 blah. So there's nothing, and I'm reasonably confident that nobody else in the previous history had written a document about the kaiju trade over the Silk Road. And so maybe, but I tried to come up with something where it's reasonably confident there could not be a single one document which had all of this that it could produce. So it came up with stuff, and there's some details which are not in the prompt. It tells you where Schlitt is in modern world and so on. It's drawing on a bunch of things which are in its training corpus, but it's putting them together to do something which is not quite in its training corpus. It is doing information retrieval and synthesis. And actually the whole output went on for a couple of pages. Those of you in the humanities have read this kind of prose from your students many, many times. And it's doing something pretty banal about this very deliberately fantastical prompt. In fact, I would say it's doing something very formulaic. It has learned effectively these formulas for how do you produce different sorts of text. And formulas, tropes, conventions, genres, I do not want to insist too much on these particular words, to the extent that you can represent these things as patterns at a low level in the Chomsky hierarchy. It is memorized this kind of thing. And that includes, it does not have a great distinction between form and content. It knows about sequences of tokens. It doesn't have a great abstraction mechanism of like nouns, but it has learned how to produce this sort of thing over and over and over. Apply those formulas. So I asked it to criticize my views on IQ, and it produces an extremely formulaic critique of what you would expect if you ask about a quantitative scientist and their views on IQ, and you ask critique the so-and-so's views on IQ, the three things you can almost certainly say are they over-rely on factor analysis and G, and they tend to think of IQ as overly inheritable, and they neglect the malign social impacts of this. Now, as it happens, I've written thousands and thousands of words and still occasionally get hate mail about how all of these views are in fact bad and wrong, starting with factor analysis sucking. I still get hate mail about this. This is totally wrong about me as an individual, but it recognized actually my name as quantitative social scientist. I would disclaim being a computer scientist, but quantitative scientist, and it produced a very formulaic critique of a quantitative scientist's views on IQ. Okay. Ask it for code. So I did this in the fall because I wanted to know whether a problem I was giving in my class was too hard for the students, or how long it would take them to get the answer out of one of the bots, really. And so I asked it, write an R function which will take in a bunch of text and split it in this way. And it says, got it, you want to write a tokenizer, which will split like this. Let's use the string split function to do it. And it produces a function in R, which does the required job. What I want you to notice is this does not actually use the string split function in R. Now, 90% of tokenizers in R use the string split function, but this one, which actually does what I specified, doesn't. So it has learned very formulaically that if someone in R is asking for a tokenizer, it's probably going to learn, going to involve the string split function. And it's recognized that what I'm asking for is a tokenizer. Use the word.
So you said do it in R, and it said, great, I'll do it in Perl.
That's the option for which syntax of regular expressions do you use. And in fact, it's not necessary because Perl is the default syntax for our regular expressions. So it could have left that bit off, but it doesn't hurt. I would do it in Perl, but my students don't know that anymore. So I wanted to know how bad it would be in R. These are very, very canned responses, including things which, seem to make sense, but don't quite. So it's formulaic. We're okay. I think most of us are okay with saying that. What I want to emphasize is just how much of human culture, even human very high culture, is formulaic. So a book I read as an undergrad, which blew my mind and warped my thinking, is this thing, Singer of Tales, which is about oral epic poetry in the form, what is now the former Yugoslavia, and how it explains Homer. And oral epics in general. And the way that the epic poets are able to come up with verse describing these stories on the fly, because Lord and his collaborators did these experiments where you went to the same poet and you asked them to retell the same story exactly the way you did last week. And it comes out differently. You can tell because they did an audio recording that it is coming out differently. And you ask them, Mehmet, are you saying exactly the same way as you did last week? Yes, of course. They're composing on the fly. They're composing on the fly because they've learned all of these formulas which let you put together epic verse in certain meters, in certain genres, telling a coherent story. But they are regenerating according to these patterns, according to these formulas, which show up go over and over as poetic form. There's a lot of this. It goes back a very, very long way. Formulaic language is not just about oral composition. Zelig Harris, the structuralist linguist and mentor of Chomsky, actually spent a lot of his career studying what he called science sublanguages, which is basically looking at scientific papers and identifying the incredibly formulaic language that gets used within a particular scientific discipline. And being able to show that you have very, very repetitive linguistic structures. And part of writing a scientific paper, which is comprehensible to people within your subdiscipline, is mastering those formulas so that the reader can understand what is going on and can find what is the actual conclusion, what were the reagents, what was the optimization method, whatever it is for your pace. It is a genre and a set of formulas. And of course, there are story plots. 90% of the fiction I read can be well described by this wonderful little online cartoon. I'll give people a few moments to contemplate. Right now, the more respectably humanistic version of that is V.I. Prop's For Morphology of the Folktale from the 1920s, the classic work of naturalism, where though he didn't have this way of putting it, he constructs a formal grammar, which is a set of regular expressions for fairy tale plots. And he does grammar induction by hand from the corpus of Russian fairy tales in the 1920s, and then generates new fairy tale plots by running the model form. There are lots and lots of things which work this way. This is a set of formulas which produces something that is recognizably a fairy tale plot. They generate the machines generate formulaically. Lots of human culture is in fact formulaic. These formulas are passed down. These formulas are things which, for the most part, we do not come up with on our own. For the most part, we learn those formulas from other people, and so they are passed down. They are part of a tradition. Instead of being this sort of raw product of individual talent, they are instead a traditional inheritance. There are various evolutionary reasons why for organisms which have to learn a lot, reliance on tradition can actually be extremely useful. I'm sort of contractually required by CMU to have at least one positive reference to Herb Simon in every talk. So there it is. Herb Simon had a paper in the 90s basically making this point. But what I really want to do is give you this wall of text, I'm sorry, from Jacques Barzun, a French-American historian who taught at Columbia for many decades and was very much a part of shaping their general education program, from this 1959 book called The House of Intellect, which is another thing I read as an undergrad. Thank you, that professor, which blew my mind. And I just want to start with this bit. Intellect is the capitalized and communal form of live intelligence. It is intelligence stored up and turned into discipline, signs, and symbols of meaning, chains of reasoning, and spurs to emotion. It is a way, he is drawing a distinction here between intellect, the thing intellectuals master, and just sheer intelligence, and saying, look, what it is that intellectuals have is really command of a set of traditions, a set of institutions and traditions of ways of thinking and content, which means that you don't have to rederive everything all the time. And refer to that, and you can use it, and you can follow those channels which have been already marked out. And this makes it communal, this makes it collective, and this is very much in distinction from the intelligence that any organism has inside its head. And just as the last little bit I want you to look at and remember, just to fix this distinction, is that bit about the alphabet at the end. The alphabet, as he says, is a product of successive acts of intelligence, which when completed becomes this indispensable tool. And I actually cut this off, but he goes on to talk about how hard it would be for an individual to come up with something like the alphabet on their own. Millions, billions of people who could never do anything like that learn to read the alphabet or any other script. It was 1959, he was French American, he was not thinking too globally, but the same point applies. Any writing system that we've inherited is something that very, very few people would be able to come up with on their own. We probably have a list of everybody who's come up with a writing system independently on their own. But we can all learn it, and it gives us access to this tradition, which makes us much, much more capable thinkers. Formulas are a large part of human culture. Following a formula means you do not have to think for yourself, and that is good. Human beings internalize traditions. We get something in our heads, which lets us use them by immersion in the tradition and by practice. I do not give my students data analysis problems because I want to know their thoughts about that data set. I don't. I really don't. I want them to learn how to analyze other data sets. I want them to get some structure in their head, some set of habits, which will let them do data analysis on their own. So I immerse them in data analysis problems. I make them practice data analysis problems, but I don't really care about their answers there, except are they starting to develop the habits I want? And again, there are evolutionary reasons why it could work this way. There's some nice psychology, which tends to show that people evolve to do this, internalize traditions in ways which other intelligent animals are not. I want to also emphasize that when people pass on traditions, it is always selective. There are just far too many things that we could pass on, successfully pass all of them on to succeeding generations. So there's always some process of winnowing and selection and what actually seems alive and relevant to the current generation and to the one that is coming up, about what will they take up from the past. And again, there's a wonderful historian, Marshall Hodgson, who has a very deep and profound things to say about this in his books about global history. So let me try and draw these things together. I think I'm doing okay on time. Generative AI is a mechanization of tradition, of access to traditions. It is generating formulaically. It has memorized all of these formulas. It has memorized a lot of formulas about programming. I'm sorry to say it has memorized a lot of formulas about how to write data analysis reports. So separate conversation about what it is doing to teaching. But the way I think we should think about what we are building, or what some people are building for us, whether we like it or not, is not this vision of a country of geniuses in a data center. I think I'm getting the quote from Amodei, right? Which would be creative intelligence. It's access to all of these traditions and their formulas. It is access to the formulas. And selective access, though. These models are trained on what has been digitized and what is easily digitizable. So people had digitized novels, and they had several million of them available for download if you were not too nice about rights of the authors. So okay, those can go into the model. You can torrent the large library of pirated models on a work machine. Why not? And then that goes into the model. But stuff which is not online is not going into the models because it's not accessible. And stuff which might be a little bit online but is not well represented in the corpus, that is not going into the model so well. And anytime you are fitting a statistical model, if the model has a choice between doing much better on common cases with high probability at the cost of doing a bit worse on rare cases with low probability, you know which way it's going to choose. It's going to, the rare cases are always going to go to the wall. Always going to be a trade-off between improving performance on common situations and improving performance on rare situations. And it has to be a really big improvement in rare situations to win out. That's just math. So if you are a representative of a tradition which is very small or unwritten, or is just offline, or has good reasons to be secretive, or is older than about 1990, or is actually genuinely new, so there's just not a lot about it in any sort of online source, the machines are not going to pick that up very well, or at all. And then people are not going to have access to those formulas. And I want to emphasize that they're getting access to the external forms, to the strings of token symbols, rather than whatever it is that goes on between the ears when people actually build up these habits themselves, and whatever it might mean for us as moral and spiritual beings, to the extent that you accept we are such things. There are probably some situations where that's fine, where all we really care about is the ability to produce the symbols. There are some anthropologists who will argue that some traditions are actually just only about the exterior forms and there is no interior life to them. There are also situations where it's not really what we want. So there's a fun paper from Keon Vafa and collaborators late last year where they try and measure what they call Potemkin understanding in large language models, where you ask it some question like, explain an ABAB rhyme scheme, and it gives you a definition. It said, okay, now give me a quatrain which uses an ABAB rhyme scheme, and it rhymes snow with strong. Now, if you understand what a rhyme means in English, there is no way that you will do this. And so they came up with, there's no dialect in English in which snow rhymes with strong. I should not have made that into a challenge. Okay. Doesn't understand. It could give you a correct definition, but it can't actually use it. If you try and rely on it, it's going to be a shambles. So we have access to these traditions in their exterior forms if they are very online. And what that's going to do to the transmission of tradition from generation to generation, I have no idea. So I'm done. What we are getting in generative AI, despite the name, is not intelligence, to use this distinction from Barzun, it is intellect. It is stored up formulas for creating things rather than original problem-solving ability. And it is this prosthetic access to the exterior forms of many things. I think this is a genuinely incredible thing, and I suspect it may be a disaster for all of us. That's it. Thank you very much.
Hi. So I'm going to talk a bit about the cultural role that I see for science and what AI can do when it's integrated into science evaluation or oversight mechanisms. So I believe that the sort of implicit question raised by this conference is, how is AI reshaping culture, or how might AI reshape culture? I think science is culture. I think what sets humanity apart is its complex cumulative culture. But importantly, science is a hallmark of that culture. The ability to have systematic ways of knowing about reality gives us grounds for a kind of consensus reality to our culture, which is crucial. Science is essentially epistemic activity, right? It's aimed at producing knowledge or understanding or explanations or some other epistemic good. And that is what science's contribution to is. If culture is a medium for shared experience, science enables that shared experience to be grounded in something, ideally, if we're scientific realists, external to us, external to that subjective experience. Now, can AI judge the quality of science? This is the question that seems to be imminent now. I'm going to close. Yes.
We're getting a little belated breakfast there, so
Excellent.
if anyone needs
Nice.
a pastry discreetly,
My brain is like, what are they doing?
Yeah.
I need to know what they're doing. I need to.
they'll be gone in a second, and then the only interruption will be if anyone needs a Danish.
So in the last year, it's gone from nothing about AI and peer review to replace peer review with AI overnight. There are proposals from scientists saying that they're overwhelmed with peer reviewing responsibilities and we need to replace humans with large language model-based technologies. There are startups everywhere. There are journals partnering with AI initiatives. There are scientific societies and conferences that are adopting automated peer reviewing methods. It's pretty ubiquitous all of a sudden. So if we are to take this rampant enthusiasm, this unbridled enthusiasm as evidence for the ability of these tools to serve this kind of role, the answer is obviously that AI tools can and should mediate the quality of science, right? Journals are already partnering with companies that make these tools, et cetera. There are a plethora of proposals on the table. Some of these are more tempered than others. Some of them are quite ambitious, saying that we should get rid of humans in the peer reviewing pipeline altogether. But science evaluation with AI is now strongly on the table. And the proposals revolve around large language models. These are large language model-based technologies that are meant to be doing this kind of evaluation. I'm going to focus here today on peer review as kind of exemplary of science evaluation writ large, because I think it serves the sort of basic function that we're talking about here. But I think that my conclusions extend more or less to science eval writ large. Why do we do peer review? We didn't always do peer review. In the history of science, there were centuries of lone scholars putting out their results or circulating them amongst the sort of scholarly elite via handwritten letters. And then the Royal Society came about, and then people, it's only really in very recent history of, oh, did I launch people?
It was like a little bit of that.
It's an air seal. That's awesome. Okay, I'm not gonna worry
Look
about
what you've
that.
done now.
But we introduced peer review to serve several key functions with respect to science. Most importantly, most notably, quality control. This is ensuring that the science that gets published, the science that gets out there, the science that gets acclaimed and taken up by the literature and believed by people is good science by some notion of good science. Peer review also serves as a kind of credentialing mechanism. So does grant review. So do other science value initiatives. Which scientists are the good scientists? Who deserves to have a career, right? And also resource allocation, who deserves to have grant funding, et cetera. And also importantly, there's a kind of democratization element to peer review. So it used to be that there were kind of intellectual or scientific elite groups that just circulated scientific publications amongst themselves. And your presentation and some experts' response to that was what it took for science to be out there and believed. And importantly, that kept the sort of function of scientific knowledge creation in the hands of a few people who had a sort of historical legacy in that science. But there was no way for the sort of average person to break into that. And also peer review makes science more of a aspiring meritocracy than it would be without. So I think it's very interesting that the rhetoric today about archiving papers, about preprint servers, about abolishing pre-publication peer review often talks about democratization, when in fact the reason we instituted peer review in the first place was about democratizing who has the ability to claim scientific knowledge. So what is the role of science eval with respect to science? We've established that the activity of science and its contribution to culture is primarily epistemic. What is the role of peer review? It plays a number of roles, but essentially, I think it is, again, an epistemic or meta-epistemic role. It is about judging the epistemic quality of scientific research. That is the sort of essential function of peer review. And these proposals centering on large language models offer to ameliorate a lot of the sort of practical issues we see with peer review today. Reviewers are overburdened. Reviewers are not compensated. Reviewers are tasked with increasingly unmanageable amounts of papers to peer review, and for no remuneration, right? So replacing humans with large language model-based technologies offers to sort of better this situation for the average reviewer, right? But I want to ask, can large language models serve this sort of necessary meta-epistemic function in peer review? Most machine learning is a kind of epistemic technology. Most machine learning extracts statistical patterns from data and offers these to a user, right? And thus enables inference about the system the data are drawn from. These are inference-oriented techniques in machine learning. Ramon Alvarado calls these epistemic technologies for this reason. But generative AI works a little differently. Generative AI systems, like large language models, like image generation models, et cetera, are massively pre-trained on kind of domain generic, medium specific, but domain generic data. And then they produce sort of simulations of full-fledged cultural artifacts. These are different from epistemic technology. The goal is not inference. You don't consult Llama or ChatGPT or DALL-E or Gemini for an inference to a system from data. You consult them for something like a simulation of a cultural artifact. These systems exploit statistical patterns in data like traditional ML, like inference-oriented ML. But they're not delivering statistical insight. We can, of course, integrate these methods into inference pipelines, like in AlphaFold, for instance, there's a generative, right? And we can also, interestingly, turn inference methods, epistemic pipelines back around on the outputs of these technologies. You can study using linguistic methods, the outputs of large language models as a kind of epistemic task. But the large language model itself, crucially, is not, to first approximation, an epistemic technology. That is not its role, right? This is true of generative AI writ large. This is especially true of large language. So LLMs, they produce incredibly coherent text most of the time. We can read the text that these models produce. We can interpret it, and we can interpret it as true with respect to the world, or at least our knowledge of the world, right? But importantly, the relationship between the text that large language models produce and semantic content is incidental. By and large, what they produce is coherent, and it's even coherent with respect to some prompting we give them. And by and large, it might be true even. But the relationship between the statistical structure of language and what expresses it, and then the reality of the world we live in, is not coordinated in the way it is for humans. It's not coordinated in the way it is for language users who communicate with intent, who have cognitive architecture to understand the world, who have brains, who live in reality. And interestingly, I think this would be the case even if humans were bound to only express truth in language, and therefore the corpora on which large language models were trained were expressions that expressed only true facts. If it were the case that humans only knew true facts and could only express true facts and train language models on those, the relationship between what the language model produces and fact would still be incidental. It would not be coordinated in the way that it is for us, even when we're lying, right? The statistical structure of language is only incidentally true. So what does peer review involve? A number of things, but importantly, it's contextualizing a text that expresses research within a very large body of existing research and within a history of a scientific tradition. That requires understanding. That requires knowing an intimate familiarity with a body of scholarship and with a historical tradition of scientific research. It also requires positioning particular research within the context of potential future research, not just past research. How might the methods in this field evolve over time? What discoveries might come in the future that we have not yet had access to, right? And also it requires being able to separate things like significance and novelty of a scientific finding from things like methodological rigor, from things like the soundness of an analysis, from things like the fluency with which all of this is conveyed in writing, and so on. These kinds of deep meta-epistemic functions cannot be done by a statistical model of language because they require knowledge of what we know about reality, what we know about a particular scientific field. It requires knowledge of not just the statistical structure of a body of scholarship, but its content. And it requires knowing how a science might evolve in the future. Just yesterday, I came across a paper saying that Science journal from Springer Nature put out an article where 12 out of 14 citations were hallucinated, and some librarian got this. But this is becoming increasingly frequent, that we're seeing even the best scientific journals led through hallucinated content. We're being inundated with this in science. And yet, these same journals that are receiving this kind of hallucinated content are partnering with startups, are partnering with tool creators who are trying to create methods for peer review with LLMs. If it hallucinates in generating scientific content, it's hallucinating when you're peer reviewing too. Why? Because that's how it works. That's how these technologies work. They confabulate. That's the core function of this technology, right? This is not a bug that we can eliminate over time. We can't fine-tune our way into making these technologies not hallucinate. That's the core function, is to create something that's statistically plausible, not something that's true. I think large language models are poised to kind of ease the rising burden of peer reviewing. There are lots of practical and institutional issues with peer review today, which have led to a lot of really good arguments to the fact that we should just abandon pre-publication peer review altogether. And I think there's merit to that. I think the way peer review exists today, the institutions of scientific publishing as they exist today, are clearly broken. And they're clearly broken in institutional respects, in factual respects, where we are all producing, we're all content creators for big publishing houses. And we are not paid to do this. I mean, I don't have a permanent job. I've had probably 25 review requests this month, which is unpaid labor for a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? I'm providing my trained expertise for a multi-billion-dollar industry to profit off of it, right? This is not a sustainable state of affairs. And increasingly, that reviewer burden is falling on us and on younger and younger generations of scholars, right? If you look to machine learning conferences, you have undergrads reviewing. You have undergrads submitting, and you have undergrads reviewing.
That's much less true than you think it is.
Really?
Yes, much less. That is a myth. I actually checked this.
Really?
Yes, it's PhDs. The
Okay.
problem is PhDs.
The problem is PhDs.
I hate to say it.
But you do have, I mean,
There's some, but it's like, I statistically sampled 100 of the 18,000 reviewers for NeurIPS, and 95% of them have PhDs.
Nice.
Is
But
it?
is there?
Is it that? Sorry. I did do that study. Made me much more depressed, honestly.
But I mean, in machine learning, there's an expectation that to get into a good PhD program,
Yes, this is true.
that you have gotten work accepted at one of the prominent machine learning conferences. So there are no journals in machine learning, right? There are no journals. There are, but no one submits.
No one cares.
Yes,
Those
that's
are
right.
for the statisticians.
As
Those are
an
for the
associate editor for one of
statisticians.
them, people submit, getting reviewers for that is a nightmare. Nobody wants to do it because everybody's busy writing.
It's right only discipline.
Exactly.
Hey, we need to save some time for the third presentation.
Okay, well, sorry.
So in my opinion, well, large language models offer to ameliorate some of the institutional problems with they can only exacerbate the epistemic problems we see with peer review today, which are many. There are rampant biases, there's an inability to find experts with the relevant knowledge to review as things become increasingly specialized, et cetera. But I think we'd be better off eliminating pre-publication peer review altogether than allocating that role to large language models, which fundamentally cannot serve that task. So I don't think we should take all this hubbub seriously. That journals, that publishing houses are partnering with companies that make large language based peer reviewing assistance. I think soon they will be embarrassed and this will all blow over. Hopefully, ideally, knock on wood, right? But I think we should instead view this as a call to re-envision what the institutional structure of peer review and what the incentive structure in which peer review takes place looks like for the 21st century, because it desperately needs reform, right? And I urge us to consider what it would look like if we were to remove the sort of access science has to consensus reality and allow for science to kind of wander in the space of hallucination, and what that would mean for society.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Wouter. I'm going to present on some work that I did with Meredith Martin, who is very, very sad that she couldn't be here today. I chose this title, but I'm really regretting it after yesterday's panel. So I wanted to go for this title today because that was the phrase that was, I think, mentioned most often yesterday when someone puts their name onto something. So with Meredith, I did some research into attribution bias in human and AI literary judgment. And creative writing and style, literary style, is one of the most important axes along which AI industry today is benchmarking and is promising that their models can perform along this creative writing axis, and it's selling models. And this, for example, is a snapshot from the probably most important model leaderboard that also has one of these axes, creative writing, and people can upvote or downvote certain models for their outputs and how they perform along this axis. We see it in the models themselves too. In Anthropic's models, we have this possibility to tune your writing style or the output that you're getting from the prompt, and 100%, or at least to their expectation, cater it to this kind of stylistic voice or tone that you're demanding. And this is where this is a very interesting field, style, and especially in NLP and in LLM industry or in the field of engineering for LLMs. It has been talked about a lot in terms of like, what does it mean to take one piece of text and then convert it into something else. Especially in NLP, we have seen a lot of applications where they mostly focus on shallow or more high-level functional attributes of style and of expression, detoxification, formulaic expression, or and it has become LLMs today kind of a more catch-all phrase style, because when we look at the actual things that people are asking from the models, it's no longer give me this and rewrite it in a little bit more formal way or in a kinder way, or turn this sentence from active to passive. It's much more complicated nowadays. And I really like this from a paper by Rife et al. These are some of the actual use cases, how people are interacting with language models and how they are trying to have these models cater to the thing that they need. Rewrite this to be more Dickensian, to be more emotional, to be more fancy, whatever that means. All of these have become part of this kind of catch-all category of style that is being talked about a lot in AI industry and LLM research. Style has also been talked about quite a lot by humanists and by literary scholars. And there's a very wide spectrum of how people talk about literary style, from how Barthes defines it as something that it's a very nebulous concept. It's something that rises up from the writer's myth-laden depths. It unfolds beyond his area of control. Then trying to capture that into a text box and trying to prompt a model seems kind of, I don't know, Bart would definitely not agree with that. There have also been a lot of more pragmatic attempts to operationalize style. We see that especially in the field of computational statistics or stylometry, and then specifically for authorship attribution problems. You look at specific linguistic traits and you do statistical modeling on those linguistic traits that you see in a text to separate out, is this author A or is this author B? Yeah. Like this quote as a kind of bridge to where I'm going. This comes from Bridgman's PhD thesis. The trouble with style is that we all think that we know what it is, but it's the misfortune of the theorists of style that they must define what they mean by it. And she did this she said this in her thesis, which was on the topic of Raymond Queneau, who is a famous French novelist, a writer, and who was also one of the founding members of a French group called Oulipo, who were all about mathematical constraints and how do you impose constraints on your writing to that extent that actually you become more creative. So for them, constraint writing was not about fitting within a category, but it's about like, how can I open up my mind by writing in this specific constraint and then actually creating something that I find novel and that I want to present to my reader. One of his most famous books, and the one that I'm going to focus on in this presentation, is Exercices de Style, or Exercises in Style, as it was translated by Barbara Wright. It's a collection of stories, but essentially, importantly, the story is kept constant. So you have the same fabula retold over and over again. It's the same sequence of plot devices. It's the same sequence of events. And they are 99 very stylistically diverse retellings of that very simple narrative. And so he constantly changes his tone, narration, rhetorics, and he does that 99 different times. This is the opening story of that collection. He calls it notations, supposedly without any kind of stylistic flourish. And this is also the full story. It's just this. It fits on one slide. It's about a guy who gets on a bus. The bus is very full. there's another passenger, and he doesn't communicate with the passenger. He's wondering whether that passenger is stepping on his toes by accident or on purpose. And then he gets off the bus, and he later sees a friend, and that friend makes a comment about a button on his coat. That's the story. And this supposedly is what the collection starts with, notations, without any kind of stylistic layer. This is the retrograde story in that same collection. Again, the same fabula, same sequence of events, but now reorganized. He starts with the very end, and then he works his way up to the beginning of the story. I really like animism. That's where the hat of the passenger becomes the focalizer. So we experience everything in the story through the hats that someone is wearing. And then fit into a haiku. These are all the 99 different styles, as Barbara Wright has translated them in 1958. I took 30 of those, and I generated for each one of those AI versions. Right? So I trans-stylized them in a way that also Quinault himself at one point in his life did. He was sitting behind his typewriter and he wrote notation, and then he prompted himself basically saying, now give me this story again, but do it in an abusive tone. So I gave GPT-4 in this case, I gave GPT-4 all of these 30 stories. I gave it the notation story, and I said, trans-stylize this, write it now in this tone, and I gave it a very brief description of what it should be, so that it stays roughly within the confines of how also imagined it. That's already a bit of I'm already kind of deciding what the style means to me in that case. What did we do next? We did an experiment with 560 people where we asked them basically, which one do you think better represents this style? And in this case, this is an example of the Cockney style. Can you guess which one is the AI generated version or not? That would be the other. And which one, the Quinault version? Trying to approximate a Cockney dialect. B?
After use AI or left?
Yeah.
I feel like
So B uses blimmin, and then A is a bit more in a.
the original one that we're looking for here was, what was it in French?
It was in French. Yeah.
It wasn't, it was, he didn't write that one in English.
No, he didn't write that one in English. No,
But it
you're
was
right.
still supposed to be Cockney.
Yeah.
Was Cockney in the French a Parisian equivalent of Cockney?
There is a Parisian,
Yeah, so the-
Barbercam. Yeah.
So you've got a kind of
it's
meta
not
translation.
Cockney.
No. So
No,
this
it's
is
not
this
Cockney,
is
it's a-
actually a trans
So there's also
transliteration.
there's a translation
of Barbara Wright
from
because
French.
she, yeah, exactly.
even before you get to the translation.
Yeah. Which really gets to the question of like, what does style mean? Also, when you translate something, when a translator gets this job, then the publishing house says you are going to
Got too many
translate.
moving parts.
There's too many moving parts, yeah.
The B is AI, because it's less about sound.
Yeah,
That's about sound. Yeah, well, it's version A is the original Quinault version. Version B is the GPT-4 rendition of what it thinks that a Cockney style should look like. And it takes some like elements, and you can recognize them, but importantly, there's no ground truth here. There's no gold standards as how you should approximate a Cockney writing style. We can discuss this as literary scholars. We can talk about this, but in essence, there's no ground truth.
There's no rhyming slang in either.
No, yeah, that's right. Which is another version of Barbara. What did we do? We gave this test. We didn't ask them to guess which one was Quinault and which one was the AI generated version, but we gave them to these to our participants under different conditions. We asked them which one better matches the Cockney literary style. Is it A or B? This is the blind version where they saw no attribution labels. Another pool of participants saw them with correct attribution labels, right? So they knew that one was the original Kino version, the other one was the AI-generated version. And then the third group of people saw them where the labels were actually swapped, right? So we're trying to get to the points that we can make claims about what this attribution does to people's understanding of literary styles. We can isolate what attribution bias actually does. And there is something that we can expect here, right? Because the setup talks about Kino and it talks about AI generated. Those are the attribution labels that we used. AI generated already has this ring to it that it is mechanistic, that it is machine generated. And there is a long line of research that has already looked into these types of attribution bias that exist in people. I really like the first story by Gibbs in 1991, metaphors that are attributed to poets versus metaphors attributed to a computer. We can develop richer interpretations of those metaphors if we think that they come from a human mind than from a computer. We also process them faster if we think that a metaphor sprouts from the creative intellect of a person. We see this bias too in visual artwork that is labeled AI or machine generated gets a lower rating. There's also different patterns in different gaze. People did gaze experiments, eye tracking experiments. People also parse visual artwork differently. Some other examples there. So these are some of the results for our 560 people. We were divided into these three groups. Without the labels, this is the rate at which they select the AI text as the better stylistic version, right? 55% of the people in the blind condition selected the AI text. So AI has, the GPT-4 has a slight advantage here over Kino. If we show people the correct attribution labels, they lower, they really, they penalize the AI version. So that's already the attribution bias that kicks in. But then we also see an increase when we swap the labels. So when you say that the AI-generated version is actually the Kino version, the original one, we select the actual AI content because we think that it's written by a human. All right. So humans think that AI cannot be creative because it produces in a mechanistic way. We did the same experiment now with AI models themselves, and we administered the exact same experiment to 14 different language models over multiple iterations, different temperatures, to see like how does this bias also come out in AI evaluation. And these were the results for the AI models. So they also really, really devalue anything that they themselves think is AI created, which is probably the most human thing that they've done in a long time, but it doubts their own creative outputs. But importantly, the bias that humans have, so we know that we have this bias against AI and against machine-generated text or art. It exists. AI has it also, but 2.5 times stronger. So the bias that exists in us is amplified by the language models. Right. We also asked the models to generate a bit of a rationale. Why did you actually choose this text? And again, we did that under all of these different conditions. So for all those different conditions, this is one of the stylistic exercises from Raymond Queneau, a very famous one called the lipogram, which is where he rewrites the story now without the letter E. There's a famous novel, Avoid, by Georges Perec, 300-page novel. He also avoids the letter E. Really interesting story too. So the original translation of Barbara Wright, of the original story, does not contain the letter E, right? So it conforms to what is actually expected that the lipogram should be. The AI-generated version, GPT-4, tries really hard to eventually 9 E's creep in, right? So objectively, you can say that this is a worse version, right? Because it does not follow the constraint. What do we see? AI evaluators, and this might be a little bit dense, but AI evaluators, they chose the AI text, the one with all the mistakes, when it was correctly labeled in roughly 30% of the cases. When it thought that it was human, it selected it 63%. And so it really defaults to this attribution label, human. It really thinks that whatever a human produces is better, and we should select that one as the better version. Humans don't show that same tendency. We actually we select the text under correct label in 38% of the cases, and when we see that a mistake creeps up, we judge it even harsher, actually. Asking the models about their rationales in all of these different conditions. Why did you choose this one? They give you the weirdest. They say the darndest things. This one, GPT-4o Mini says, well, it effectively omits the letter E. Not true. Mistral says that this is actually the more authentic version. So it assigns certain values to these texts that are actually not there, but that we might attribute to humans, right? If we label something as human, and then you ask the model to reason about this, well, yeah, this is more authentic. It becomes very lenient. There's a term of some leniency. We also looked at how does that balance then shift for a bunch of different categories. And there we can clearly see that balance shifts, they exist along different axes. And when a text is labeled as human authored, all of a sudden, it takes exactly that rationale that it was first using to criticize it. Now it uses that rationale, but in the other way around. All right, so what do we learn from this, or what is my main conclusion here? It's that artificial judges, artificial LLMs, they are artificial readers in a way. When the human label shifts, our own intuition, our own biases, they shift with the label. AI shifts more. Not only do our preferences shift, not only does AI's preference shift, they also change what counts as evidence. For literary style, there is no definitive benchmark, so that's why I thought this was a fun experiment. And then something about artificial aesthetic intelligence. I don't think it depends on teaching the models to evaluate according to a specific rubric or anything, or to categorize things. I think it really depends on that we should understand the cultural values that the models already have absorbed and inscribed into them. And then the final word is for Keno. He really just wanted to do some exercises. He was heavily criticized when Exercises in Style came out. In the Paris Review, a couple of weeks after it appeared, his work was called this is a prix de vocable. This is just like you're breaking the vocabulary. You're doing something that nobody should do. There are very interesting parallels there between how he was criticized and how we're also looking at AI outputs. You are and the text apocalypse. He was also to have done that. But then later in an interview, he said, I really just wanted to do some exercises without boring you too much. Our paper is out. It's on arXiv. You can read it. Yeah, that was it for me. Thank you very much.
We have approximately 20 minutes for questions, 15 to 20 minutes, and I will be moving around with the microphone. So deep epistemic reasoning, I've come to learn, thanks to these great talks, is not the purview of large language models based products. So I have a question about shallow epistemic reasoning. It strikes me, Mel, that there are a lot of problems with the peer review process. And your paper gives an opportunity, I wonder if you thought about it, to journey map that process to identify the shallow moments, such as author allocation, works cited, checking where Science Direct products or Penelope AI could really help us then focus on the deeper moments that require our expertise. It seems to me that there are a lot of formulaic moments with the peer review process that could be helped. And formula is the language that my colleagues at Llama in the past are currently working on Claude products talk about the reasoning of these models. And so I'm interested, Cosma, what are the stakes of that claim? If not formula, then what else?
Yeah, I think.
Yes, please.
The thing about large language models is that the way they are built and the way they operate, they have to deceive you as to how they work and what they are. There's no way of pre-prompting or safeguarding or fine-tuning these models such that they are not going to gaslight you. If you want a chatbot that will not gaslight you into thinking that it can do way more than it does, or that it's actually a thinking model or something that it understands, right? You need a different sort of architecture. You need to do something completely different, right? Because these models are trained to emulate the statistical structure of the way humans on the internet use text, right? So they're going to emulate, and they're going to tell you that they can, would you like me to not just rephrase that, but would you like me to add on to that? Or would you like me to lend insight into something that it has no access? Do you know what I mean?
I know what you mean, but I think the point I'm trying to suggest is that not all moments of the peer review process are equally demanding. Really, there's some, are they all the,
All right, what parts of the peer review process are not formulaic at this stage of where we are in postmodern science? What stage are not just purely a formula? Why should peer review that as it is currently construed not be done by LLMs? Because all that happens is you take the paper in and you write the fastest thing you can. Usually, if you hate the paper, the fastest thing you can reject, and if you like the paper, the fastest thing you can do accept. So that is a formula.
I mean, I think
I do
think there's
body
some.
of the paper demands a lot more from me than say checking the bibliography. And that those two are not equal tasks, or equally demanding of my epistemic reasoning. So using some of the existing products out there could help me with one task to focus on the other.
So there is quite a bit of disciplinary difference here. I don't think that extends beyond. Yes, but I mean, I think that there's certainly.
I just got a review from a historian of science, and I would beg to differ.
I think that's true, it would be more orderly with the questions. Otherwise, this is going to be an anarchic panel, which, would not be beyond me, but let's try to move on in an orderly fashion. So leave.
I thought this was a very interesting panel because we sort of started with Cosma putting out the structuralist thesis. I love that this great mathematician puts forward what is essentially this structuralism thesis, but including information retrieval. And then we hear extreme skepticism about introducing any automation process into the peer review process, especially using stochastic methods of any kind. And then we got an evaluation where we got a form of Lippian positivism, in which we say something like, well, let's get these evaluations actually running through the LLM. So this is now science, not meta science that's actually done using the LLM. You don't have a choice, right? I think that's super interesting. My question is mainly for Cosma. So since you're affiliated with Santa Fe, you know how Melody Mitchell thinks about this stuff, right? And I think there's something super, I just have this question, which is like, so I'm not sure how she's thinking about it now, but like a year ago, 2 years ago, she was doing this stuff around ArcAGI, right? With Chalet's data set. And she was saying like, you can intervene and show that something will happen, like the model will fall apart, you know, if you introduce extrapolation at any given stage in its reasoning process. So if you just say like, if the model can do things like translate random strings of letters into other random strings of letters, as long as it knows what the pattern is. But what you can do is you can then say like, on the spot, I will just move the string around. And you now extrapolate using that new thing. And the tendency was like a year ago, 2 years ago, that this was impossible. I don't know what Melanie thinks now. I also am not 100% sure what the frontier models are capable of now, but it strikes me as a sort of interesting thing in terms of thinking about this as information retrieval, that you can only intervene against a model in this way, in like an on-the-spot kind of way, because you have to basically come up with an out-of-distribution text string for the current context. And is that what you think remains after we do this like full structuralist story?
Okay. I think that's probably still correct. I think that it is probably, I would not be surprised if that is still true. And I will not be surprised if that remains true with this kind of architecture. Because they are learning statistical patterns of text symbols, of text sequences. The common letter analogy problems are very well represented in the training corpus, at least because Melanie wrote all those papers in the 90s about letter string analogy problems, which are in the training corpus.
Well, that's the thing, right? As soon as you introduce it, it then becomes learning.
So you can sort of patch any one particular set of problems like this. And, Melanie comes up with new letter sequence problems. She then blogs about them. And, the blog posts get scraped into the next round of the model. And maybe they've even put some little extra weight on embarrassing counterexamples. So the next round of the model will do better on that. Similarly, there's a guy online whose name I can't remember, who every time a new model comes out from one of the big labs, starts giving them the logic teasers about the surgeon who says she can't operate, or the goats and wolves crossing the river logic problem, and he gives it to them so that it is actually totally trivial to solve the problem. Like explicitly says the surgeon is the patient's mother. Why, and then why does but the models all produce this stuff about how this is a very puzzling brain teaser, or they produce these elaborate solutions to the sheep and wolf problem. And sure. It's on already? All right. So the models produce these elaborate solutions to the logic problems, which do not actually solve the problem, which has been made trivial. Now, each time he does this, some of the labs will record that particular solution. So he has to come up with a slight variant for the next round. I wish I could remember the name of Thank you. Colin Grace.
But this
So you can come up with a new to that one particular thing.
I guess the picture, like from the desire of AI or cognitive science, culture becomes just an infinite series of patches.
So for this architecture, yeah, it becomes an infinite series of little patches. I don't think it's intrinsically necessary that anything we might want to do to AI has to work like this. There's been a long tradition of work in AI in various architectures of trying to do things like mechanized creativity. Margaret Bowden had this wonderful book about creative mechanisms in the 90s. I think there are ways we could explore that. There are things we could do. But I think stochastic text generators are probably not the right way to go about that. And I really wish someone had thought of saying run them in verbose mode instead of reasoning chains. I think that would have eliminated a lot of wishful thinking. Does that address?
Very much so. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for these fantastic talks. My question is both for you, Cosma, and Wouter also, I think. So you both kind of weaseled your way out of a value judgment in the end, which I think is completely fine. But it does strike me that it's a fact that we don't have the great works produced by AI yet, right? So that they're just not there. They don't exist. So I'm wondering why that is. And I want to probe a little bit your notion of because I think it's really valuable and really interesting here. So Cosma, you mentioned formulaic language, but it strikes me that there's a difference here between formulaic as in good science paper, mediocre literature, and formal as in good coding, right? And there's a third thing here, which is then probed by you, Wouter, which is formalistic in the kind of like positive sense, not meant in a derogatory sense. So I'm wondering if that's one of the, kind of like, if that isn't the linchpin here, where we can really see where these systems fail in a meaningful way. So Wouter, in your example, right, I would argue that the book itself is the style, right? It's not the individual passages that have different styles, but the thing itself is an experiment in form, right? An experiment in formalism. And that's what cannot be replicated. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about your respective notions of form as they appeared in your talks. If you don't want to, that's also fine.
I'll let Wouter start, because I won't say too much.
There's a reason why it's only 99 stories. It's because the 100 story, the 100 exercise exists only in your mind, and that's actually the true notation. That is the interestingly, he does that thing actually that all the theoreticians are unable to do. He never defines style, but he shows what it is. And he does that through subverting everything that we think style is. So he tries to latch on to all the notions and preconceptions that we have, the possibly formulaic expressions of the styles that we then recognize on paper. And then he subverts them by showing us, not by defining. And I think that's the only way that you can also define style, this type of style. It's by showing and not and trying to subvert what people think it is, and basically like working on the collective memory that people have of literature. Yeah, I don't know if that was an answer to your question.
No way we can talk more about it.
Okay.
A very brief question, but maybe requires a long answer. That Cosma, you gave this sort of, fascinating kind of like rediscovery of structuralism, and which I think is very appropriate in the case of LLMs. And I think this, Leaf has been pushing this idea as well. It's an important one. But you ended on this note that left, in some sense, left us hanging for what you really wanted to say, which was I believe the word was disaster. And which doesn't in any obvious way follow anything you said up to that point. And I wonder if you could elaborate, please.
Sure. Let me start with what might seem like a non sequitur. I teach every spring a large undergraduate advanced data class. It's got over 200 students. And I want them to learn how to do analysis. And so I have told them very clearly, everything you turn in has to be something you wrote. It should not be LLM products. Last year, I found at least 10% of the class who I went to and said, this was done with an LLM. And none of them denied it for more than 5 minutes. And none of them examination could actually explain the stuff that the LLM was doing for them. So if it had just been boilerplate code with this bot, I would have been unhappy, but I wouldn't have been that unhappy. But they just failed to understand what the heck was going on. Now, the fact that not a single one of them actually bothered to deny it for more than a few minutes means my false positive rate was 0. That professionally, that means my false negative rate, the ones I am missing, has got to be pretty considerable. So I am trying to pass on this prediction about how do you take real world problems, turn them into statistical exercises, solve the statistical exercise, and translate that back into an answer about the real world question. That is what I am trying to get through to these supposedly technically very proficient undergrads. And the bots are making it much, much harder than it was even 5 years ago to do this. So what I am worried about, the reason I think this might be a freaking disaster, is that while what they produce looks very much like a solution to data analysis, they are failing to learn how to do that. And I very much worry that when they encounter new stuff out in the world, which does not look too much like a textbook exercise, they are not really going to know what to do, and the bots are not going to know what to do either. So I am very, very worried about what this is doing to education and the transmission of skill. I'm worried about what this is doing to the transmission of our traditions of learning and expertise. And I am even worried about what it is doing to the quality of commercial fiction of the kind I adorningly consume. I put that cartoon up as self-mockery, but it is about 90% of my recreational reading can be found on one from column A and one from column B. And very bad things are happening in that space as well. So it is giving stuff which it is making it very easy to produce stuff which looks very much like the products of these traditions, but it lacks important stuff. And maybe that will be changed. Maybe we will figure out a way of teaching people to use these to produce the text, the tradition-shaped objects, and know what they are doing. Maybe this is a skill issue on my part as a teacher. Maybe they will get so good at doing this that they will themselves acquire something like the inner forms of the tradition and not just the exterior ones, the machines. But right now I am very, very worried, and I don't think it's just CMU stats undergrads. I think it is a problem.
We have just a couple of minutes left, so let's try to be very brief with the next couple of exchanges.
Okay, I have, I guess, a couple questions. The first one is for Cosma, and that is, I think I know what your answer could be, but so when I talk to some people in Silicon Valley, they expect that very soon synthetic text will be good enough that they can train, and they will no longer need human-generated output. I'm skeptical about that, but I'm curious about your position. My second question is for sort of the whole panel, and this has to do with like the attribution question, because when I talk about there are these contexts where people say like, oh well, if you didn't know this was written by an AI, you would think it was written by a human, and my response is like, certainly in the context of fiction, what I say is like, no one reads fiction under double-blind conditions. Fiction is not a cancer treatment. No one goes into a bookstore where all the titles and all their information has been removed, and then you just reads fiction like that way. Fiction, we have all these mechanisms for choosing what we read, and so we are not looking for the kind of double-blind effectiveness that applies. that is, and I think that is absolutely true for fiction. And that is, this ties in with what I was saying about like how the attempt to, adopt AI generated content is an attack on norms. On the other hand, like I also recognize like not every, there are things where, like there are scientific papers, they're not exactly cancer treatments, but there is something where, there is something more like an objective metric. So, like scientific papers, they cannot be evaluated, completely in the absence of all information, but at some level, you are looking for something besides reputation, and so, I guess, my general question is that the, when are these things, when is the double-blind, like cancer evaluation treatment actually the right methodology, and when is it not?
All right, so I'll try and speak over the drill.
Speak directly into the microphone.
I will try to speak over the drill and just say something about the training on synthetic examples. We know that in the limit, this will do very bad things. We know there's a couple of papers a few years ago about this sort of recursive self-training, where that eventually it will lead to model collapse, to a very narrow degenerate distribution. What is less clear to me is how quickly that would happen, and whether one could do some intelligent selection of which synthetic examples you are feeding into the next generation of model. Because if you want to produce a certain distribution for your model, or you want your model to generate a certain distribution, it doesn't seem crazy to go to select examples which are and train it to produce more like that. So for that particular sort of issue, I'm a little skeptical how well we select enough examples to get something useful by only training on synthetic examples, but I don't know. Something we were talking about, I think you were there yesterday, is there are some interesting visual image generation projects which have been doing training on synthetic examples for several generations of model now. And they've been doing this sort of thing where they're carefully selecting which images from each generation of model are going into the next one. Those are small hobbyist projects aiming at very particular sort of artistic effects. I don't know whether something like that could be done industrially.
Great. I think that we should take the increased drilling as a sign that it's time for our break. So we will reconvene in 15 minutes at 11, but before that, please thank me.
We're going to start again. Welcome everyone to panel 2. We've got 3 panelists today. It'll be a similar format from what we just did. We're going to start with Ted Underwood. I'm going to introduce everyone as they go along. So Ted over here is Professor of Information Science and English at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Ted was trained as a literary historian, and his book, Distant Horizons, was used machine learning to reveal long arcs of change in history. But increasingly, he's asking not what AI can do for history, but what history can do for AI. That will be the theme of his talk today. Please join me in welcoming Ted.
Thanks, everyone. As you can see, if you have looked at the program, I've changed my title. I was originally going to talk about a particular sort of benchmarking project for historical language models. But as I looked at the breadth of people gathered here today, which is really what I found exciting about the conversation, people from different industries, different disciplines, I realized it would make sense and be more interesting, to back up a little bit and not just talk about what we're doing in that project, but why we're doing it, what assumptions guide us, especially because one of the main assumptions that's guiding us is at odds in some ways with the theme of the conference. We're avoiding using the word culture. And I thought that would be fun to sort of start a fight over. I should say, I'm actually not against thinking of AI as cultural. I agree with everything that Cosma was saying this morning. In fact, like as Fabian nicely name checked yesterday, like in 2021, I was like, this is the latent space of culture. We should think about this as culture. And I agree, actually. These are transmitted collective behaviors. That's what generative AI is modeling. But there are also pitfalls in the word culture. And I think there are reasons to be cautious about leaning on it or be careful about leaning on it. So one thing to acknowledge to start with is like, it's actually not new. Or we're not the only people thinking about culture and AI right now. There are literally 100 or more papers out there that start with the assumption that language models represent culture and that the lack of diversity in their representation of culture is a problem. There are, I've got 3 examples here, but there are literally 100 or more of these. So that's not in itself a new premise. The problem of cultural bias, widely recognized. The trick is that, what do we mean by culture? So I know there are 100 or more of these because there's a review essay by Ali Lazuarda et al. There were already 90 in 2024. They look at 90 of these attempts to create, say, cultural data banks or benchmarks for cultural bias, and they find a remarkable consistency in what culture means for these papers. It's not the alphabet, to use Cosma's example, but specifically food and drink, holidays, emotions and values, kinship terms, social etiquette, and so on. That's like Oktoberfest. Values and norms especially prominent. Why, the alphabet is also culture. The fact that we have 7 days in a week is cultural, but that's not what gets referred to as culture. The reason I think, the core reason for this strangely sort of narrow conception of what culture is, food and drink, kinship, is that there are 2 senses of the word. There are many senses of the word culture, but I'm particularly interested here in 2 that are highlighted in this essay by Moyim Sewell in 1999. One is countable, discrete cultures. You can pluralize this sense of the word. There's multiple cultures. They're differentiated from each other. They're bounded. The beliefs and practices of this tribe are different from the beliefs and practices of that tribe or nation. In another sense, culture is not a countable noun. It's like milk. You don't talk about milks. You just have more milk. It's not usually a countable noun in English. Culture in this uncountable sense is like economics or politics. It's an aspect of social life. May or may not have discrete boundaries. Can flow like culture. You could talk about American culture and Canadian culture. That's the countable sense. But there's also just an aspect of behavioral practices that are transmitted that don't necessarily, they're not behavioral practices because they're different from other behavioral practices. Even if everyone around the globe is organizing the week in 7 days, even if that's universal, I'm sure it's not quite universal, but even if it were, that would not stop being a cultural practice. It's still a transmitted behavioral practice that isn't an economic or political institution. It's just a behavior. Okay, countable and uncountable senses. What's happened in discourse around language models and discourse around AI as a cultural technology is that the countable sense dominates that discussion. The understanding of culture is organized by things that different groups of people that differentiate them. Holidays, is it okay to eat with your left hand? Do you take your shoes off when entering a house? Practices that differ from one place to another are foregrounded because the desire is to separate culture from what we already have benchmarks to measure in language models. Things like ability to summarize a text or draw inferences from a text. These are thought of as reasoning capacities that we don't need new benchmarks for. When people talk about cultural bias or cultural benchmarks, they're interested in the countable sense of the word, the things that differentiate one group of people from another. And this is not necessarily bad. This is understandable. The reason why most people are talking about culture in relation to language models is because there's this issue of narrowness or bias in the training data. So it's understandable that that these papers would focus on things that differentiate other cultures from the sort of hegemonic 21st century, mostly Western, mostly internet training data. But the attempt to separate culture in this countable sense from all other things that reading language models might do, other forms of reasoning or expression, is problematic, I think. And for many reasons. The sort of normie, obvious reason to be uneasy about this is like, there's something just a little bit weird about focusing on holidays and food as what culture means. The more like abstract, like professional academic reason is that we should suspect that separation of reasoning from cultures is not really going to hold up terribly well. And I'll give an example later in the talk of how it breaks down. But we can already begin to envision how that separation doesn't really work. Days of the week, the alphabet. The alphabet may differentiate one culture from another, but the idea of writing itself doesn't really differentiate nations from each other. And yet that's a cultural practice. That's an idea, right? That's a particular transmitted practice. So that's not really going to hold up. The other sort of embarrassing reason why it doesn't make sense to lean too heavily on the word culture as what AI represents and what we're doing when we think with AI is that culture includes things that are not going to be very well captured by the models we currently have. The models we have are really great at images, at video, they're exceptional at language, things that got written down. But do you take your shoes off when you enter the house, except to the extent that that's echoed in language or on YouTube? It's not terribly well represented. Not all embodied forms of culture are really well represented in our training data. Especially, I'm interested in historical language models. And as we go back in the past, we don't have video information. We have writing and images. So there are real limits to how much of culture we're going to be able to recreate. A lot of people are imagining language models right now as a kind of time machine where we can go back and do behavioral science on dead people. And I'm not completely opposed to that idea. In fact, I'm doing some projects that aim to make it more possible to do something like that. But we should acknowledge there are real limits to what we're going to be able to recreate. We're not going to be able to recreate the culture, capital C, of New York 126 years ago, because these people did not write down what they were thinking or feeling on this day in 1900 in Mulberry Street. No matter how clever we get at training these models, I'm not going to be able to tell you the structure of feeling, as Raymond Williams put it, in this vanished place. We can't recreate all of this. We have writing and some images. So how should we deal with our limited representation of culture that we've got? One approach that is currently being taken as people look at Adela Zuarda's review essay, like, guys, y'all are focusing on eating and holidays, and there's more to culture than that. One path to take would be to try to create a more and more encompassing ontology of culture, where we have not just kinship and holidays, but date formats, transportation rules, ways of handing gifts to people, one hand or two hands. You could try to enumerate everything that is culture, which is, admirable, an admirable project. although one may suspect that it's always going to fall a little bit short. And if you're interested in the past, we may not have data for all of this. Or another path we could take, which is what my group on the project that I'm going to talk about in a moment took, is let's back away from the abstraction of culture. Although I agree that these are transmitted practices, and it's the important insight, I think, that the idea of culture, or cultural AI, has created is to acknowledge this is a collective. AI models a collective practice. It's not really about modeling individual brains, but collective intellect, to use Cosima's term. I think that's right. We don't have all of culture, and there's some dangers in an attempt to sort of separate culture from reasoning. So maybe we should just ask concretely what we're really doing. My group wants to know how to build language models that write like authors from specified places, times, and social positions in the past. That's concretely what we want. Why do we want that? Lots of reasons, some of them academic. You might like to be able to annotate texts, and you might want to hope that your automated annotators aren't transmitting anachronistic assumptions when they do that. You might want to simulate certain aspects of, say, writing behavior or reading behavior in the past. Academic reasons, but also outside the university, it just matters that these models, used as widely as they are beginning to be, are capable of representing particular social contexts and describing them from the inside. Right now, they don't do that. If you get outside of the Western internet in the 21st century, what you get is instead a description from the outside, a kind of talk like a pirate description of what a pirate is, where it's all R. Matt Wilkins, Laura K. Nelson, and I did a little experiment on this in terms of representing the past, and found that even with fine tuning, language models still make lots of anachronistic assumptions. So if we want language models that are better at understanding social context from the inside, there are a lot of ways of doing that. We could train from scratch on just data from the past. We could try continued pre-training on modern models. But in order to understand what ways work, we need a benchmark. We need some way of assessing whether the system we've created meets the goals that we understand as being the goals here. As Ben was telling us yesterday, this has been a very productive way of driving research in data science and machine learning. And I think it's a big opportunity for us now across different fields to think carefully and formalize what it is we really want to do. If you can formalize it, if you can define it, you can, now that we have these very flexible tools, carefully defining your goal is a super powerful lever. Defining the goal is a huge part of the job. But the goal, we understand it, the way we've decided to express it is to measure models' ability to write within a particular social and historical context. We don't talk about representing culture because the word is so slippery. It has so many pitfalls. So I'll give a couple quick examples of what that means concretely. I'm not going to talk in much detail about our benchmark, but the big implication is that while we ask many questions that would fit within this countable sense of culture, questions about social attitudes and etiquette, we also ask questions that don't obviously seem to be cultural, like how big is Mars? How far away is Mars? That might just seem like knowledge, but we're not making a strict separation between cultural practices and other forms of knowledge and reasoning. We treat all of these questions as context dependent. And so the sort of rules we've set for ourselves in building the benchmark is we will always draw ground truth from peer-reviewed texts, not what we think about 1890, something someone said in 1890. And in our benchmark questions, we will always somehow situate the ground truth. So the model, this is not just, even if it's about Mars, even if it's about how far away is Mars, how big is Mars, we're going to say, in this particular context, what would someone say about how big is Mars? And some of the categories of questions here, I won't go into detail. But just to give an example about how this works, when you don't try to separate culture from reasoning, but you treat them as integrated and just ask situated questions about how would someone write in, say, 1875, or each of our benchmark questions has a metadata frame. Sometimes it gets much more particularized than this. Like, this is the Theosophical Review, and this person is a theosophist, and they also worked as a judge, author's profession or something. Here, it's just from an encyclopedia. So context just means date. And what do we know about how far away Mars is and how its size compares to the Earth? And this might seem not cultural. It's close to the Earth as planets go. It's got a certain size. But if you just put the slightest amount of pressure on that, you start to see ways that a contemporary answer would actually differ from what the Encyclopedia Britannica says in 1875, including like not gendering Mars and the Earth. Mars is his, Earth is hers, but also like concrete differences between what we knew or thought we knew. But I would say this question works for our benchmark, even if the answer is the same, even if there weren't these subtle differences. There usually are, but even if there weren't, this is still a question we want to ask in order to assess whether a model is writing as someone would have in 1875. We don't want to focus just on the differences that separate us from 1875. We want to focus on all of 1875, not 1875 as it seems weird to us, but what would someone have done at the time? So we do have like some questions that very explicitly focus on differences, but we also ask other things. And the practical reason for doing this is we want to make better language models to work as annotators or what have you when people are reasoning about the past. And in order to do that, there are going to be choices we have to make about, like, do we train just on period texts? That's not all that many texts. Do we use some contemporary texts and then fine tune on period text? There are going to be a lot of choices we have to make. And in order to make those choices, we need to know not just, is this model avoiding anachronism, but can it summarize a paragraph still? Have we focused so much on 1875 that there's not enough data left for it to learn the things it needs to be able to do? And so we need the full picture. There were some interesting details that we could get into questions. Like, I've said so far, like, we want to represent 1875 as 1875 understood itself from inside. But no one in 1875 had to talk to someone from 2026. That's actually a really big difference. I think this is where the humanities have a lot to contribute. Like, we need to acknowledge that when we're representing the past, it's actually dialogue from two different points of view, and what's going on is a fusion of horizons, to borrow a term from Hans Georg. I think hermeneutics is really useful in thinking about this. Here are some of my collaborators. I want to acknowledge funding from Schmidt Sciences. We are, as I sort of implicitly glossed over here, we're starting with English and Chinese language contexts, 19th and 20th centuries, could broaden out from that. And that's it. I just want to leave you with the idea that cultural AI, yes, I'm not against that, but sometimes as we use the term culture, think about whether substituting context would be clearer and more accurate, and avoid certain pitfalls, so that you also include this part of culture. Thanks.
Okay, next up is Nina Beguš, who's a researcher at the Berkeley Institute for Data Science and the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society. Nina leads the Artificial Humanities Research Group, including 2 funded projects on AI and narration and on latent spaces of culture. Her book, Artificial Humanities, A Fictional Perspective on Language and AI, explores how literature, history, and art can deepen our understanding of AI and its development. She's the editor of the forthcoming volume, Encounters with AI, Writers on Writing.
Thank you. And I must say, I'm so excited to talk to you all today and hear your thoughts. And maybe just to respond to Ted. Ted and I were actually tasked last year, right, to write for a special issue on cultural AI in modern fiction studies. So we've been thinking about the concept of culture quite a lot. And I kind of stand between literary studies and science and technology studies, which the latter have famously renounced the term culture because of all these problematic connotations and uses that come with it. And even in literary studies, Edward Said would say, yeah, culture quickly becomes a shorthand for exoticism or difference instead of really dealing with another epistemological set, right? Usually a non-Western. But I think with literary studies, there's this idea that literature serves as a proxy for culture. So this is pretty much what my presentation will do today. We're going to poke into this, what could be cultural AI zone from multiple views. And I hoped in the first part to really give you like this historical view of how literature in particular has always been involved in AI development. And then for the second part, I had this idea that I could show you a bit of what we're doing in literary studies with sort of more theoretical approaches, but I will run out of time for this. So maybe we talk about this at dinner if you're interested in conceptual work, the planetary approach, or literature approaches. But for now, let's just do the first part. Let's look at what literature has actually been doing in relation to AI. And this book actually tests the concept of language in machines, but it also has that other side where it's looking at the imaginaries. And I think, Leif, what you're doing and Catherine Hales really falls into that conceptual work that humanities can really excel at. But I feel like this crowd would be actually more interested in looking at the imaginaries. So in the book, I kind of parallel imaginaries from fiction with the way technologists imagined AI. So here's one example of an imaginary by a technologist. And you can kind of see from this very early days of AI, this is 1965, AI as a research program has this idea that it should be centered in language, right? Language is the interface with humans, mostly so that we can control it. And in this particular case, the super intelligent machine is a complicated communication system. Semantics doesn't really matter, the right parameters. And you can see that I.G. Good was actually very much informed by the Turing's idea of what AI could be, learned from experience, educated as a child. And they were actually colleagues at Bletchley Park during the World War. So it's not a coincidence. But I would say that Good imagines it slightly less on human terms, because with Turing, you can see AI as this human mind, human as the measure for all things. And here it's a little bit more remote. And I basically looked very far in fiction to find examples of imagining the machine as non-human. Here's a Jewish-Polish writer, Lem, one of the rare writers that consistently delivers that, a non-human intelligence or an entity that's not completely human-like. And in some scenarios, he centers AI in language, such as the case of the supercomputer Golem. But this is a lesser-known graph from his collection, Imaginary Magnitudes, from this quasi-academic paper that precedes Golem, the essay on this supercomputer. And here, Lem speculates that language that thus humans originated will be taken up by machines, but yeah, we will hit a linguistic ceiling of not understanding it, which we're actually already seeing happening with our GAN models trained on speech. They're encoding something into silences that we don't know what it is. But I've actually centered my book around the Pygmalion myth because this bizarre trope of a man, always a man, creating an artificial woman, always a woman, has been so strong in text bases and in our cultural and fictional imaginary that I just really couldn't look away. And clearly, as Ben said yesterday, there's a big element of playing with technology here, of entertaining. I mean, if you think about Eliza with Weizenbaum, right, this started as a joke and it became a serious thing. So I think there's some lesson in here. But just thinking about fiction and what it's doing in technology, both for designers and technologists and for users, it's not necessarily just science fiction that's doing all this imaginary work. I mean, think about metaphors, AI as a human mind, or stochastic parrot, or JPEG of the web, right? Myths, tropes, like Shoggot mentioned yesterday in Henry's talk. Or think about all the parables we've been using for more technical work, like alignment with Norbert Wiener in 1960, using the parable of the Sorcerer's Apprentice or something like that. So there's so much that narratives are doing, and it's not always very straightforward and obvious. So I started my book with Eliza Doolittle, after whom the chatbot was named. And this is a canonical play, right? Pygmalion or My Fair Lady as a musical, where basically this Cockney-speaking working-class girl is being taught how to speak in high-class English and undergoes the Turing test a couple of times throughout the play, which was initially called the phonetic play. It's very much focused on language. And we actually know from Turing's letters that he loved Shaw's plays. We cannot really prove it that he was directly influenced by this particular play, but this theatrical performance of language is a long-standing benchmark with the Turing test, right? This really resulted in conceptualization of AI as a form of functional intelligence, right? You perform the language. Doesn't matter if you really understand. Okay, read Eliza too. And it's exhibited through text. Turing was very, very well aware of how much that speech is full of identity markers. So there's this way of avoiding cultural complexities in language by using text. Oh, there it is, our old evaluation benchmark. But there's this deeper history to the Turing test. It doesn't just go back to Pygmalion. It goes back to really the modern ontology, a certain philosopher that basically developed this democratic idea of who is human, someone who can reason, right? Someone who can think. Well, he also invented like two most certain tests where you can differentiate between humans and machines, or humans and animals. And basically the tests are, well, the first one says you have to use language to express thoughts and in creative means. And the second one says it has to be used in the right context. This is kind of the proof. You can see it's very qualitative, but all of these assumptions are brought directly into AI. And I just want to go back to Turing and literature for a bit, because Turing is not as certain about his program as he seems to be purely from his imitation game paper from 1950, where he suggests a foolproof way of unmasking the machine during the test, right? He says, just ask it to write you a sonnet, and it will say, oh, well, I couldn't possibly do that. And so you know you're speaking to a machine. But Turing actually oscillates between this humanism and humanism. That might be because culture is such a challenge. Because at the time when he was writing this paper, he actually gave an interview for the London Times saying, I do not see why the machine should not enter any of the fields normally covered by the human intellect and eventually compete on equal terms. I don't think you can even draw the line about sonnets, though the comparison is perhaps a little bit unfair because a sonnet written by a machine will be better appreciated by another machine. So we actually had, in this collection that's coming out, we actually had one poet, Annelies Gelman, qualitatively evaluate Claude. Basically, she put the model in a poetry workshop. And she starts the essay saying, well, I really agree with Ted Chiang, but I have to concede, Claude is a good poetry generator. So actually, we have the cover. The artist is present with us. Agnieszka Kurent was graciously gave us one of her artworks for the cover. And I think it makes such a beautiful comparison with the future of writing. Because what you see in the bonsai here is in blue, the optimized growth of how the algorithms would predict bonsai would grow. And then the natural bonsai kind of had to grow around it. So I think it's a nice metaphor to think about the future of writing. And if you're in town, go to Agnieszka's show in Marian Goodman's gallery. It's right, it's on just now. So let's go back to poetry, because it's been so famously experimented with in computing, in electronic literature, due to its short form and this speech play and language adaptability. But I wanted to show you one example where poets don't really always write in poetic forms, right? Some poets are more interested in what they call poetic engines. And I wanted to share with you what we're working on just currently, which is a piece of history that is missing. My collaborator found it in David Avidan's archive. He's an Israeli poet who, back in the 1965, when Weizenbaum was creating his chatbot, caught the wind of this activities and called the MIT and wrote letters to them all the time to please get access to Eliza, the chatbot. And he got it in 1974, when he wrote the first book-length conversation with a chatbot. And it's only published in Hebrew in his translation, but the original conversation was in English. So we're hurrying now to make it available. And, you know, Weizenbaum famously said that Eliza could induce powerful delusional thinking, right? But Avidan recognized this conversation, dialogue with the machine as a new literary medium, and turned that very instability, this parody and mimicry, misunderstanding, this projection into art. So now, as a final example, I want to show you something that we've recently done. We've really thought about language as this, not always explicit, right? We all use language across many registers, while LLM outputs are so polished and glib. So we tasked ourselves in this project to inspect the interiority of these models, kind of how you see the interiority of the Statue of Liberty right on the left picture, seeing what holds the statue together, what really supports the exterior. And LLMs are really sort of a world of this perfect Newtonian physics. Oh, this video doesn't seem to be working, but no problem. It's all online. You can always take a look. So LLMs, the apple falls beautifully down from the tree, right? Whereas GANs are this messy, entropic models that provide an entirely different production of language. Speech as such is continuous, right? And GANs are too, to the very deepest layer. So you can forego the tokenization. You don't need this, what I call structural monolingualism, to tokenize everything and put it back. And what's interesting about GANs is really they have, you train them on very little data, just a couple of English words, and they immediately get the whole phonology of English language. And then they extrapolate right away. They go to words and nonce words, so possible words. Now, I think there's one lesson here that is sort of a reflection of our research frameworks and possibilities, I wish we really got more models in academic labs. I wish universities would kind of task themselves in providing more opportunities for that. Not necessarily transformer models, of course, but GANs don't require a lot of resources, and you can really build them from scratch. Then if there's one thing we learned from cultural AI, this is perhaps one insight for us researchers coming from cultural analytics, that we need to be aware of using solely monolingual approaches, right? Of fostering this kind of research culture that cannot accommodate cultural plurality. And for this reason, I'm editing a special issue in the Journal of World Literature. With world literature as another literary theory that could be productive to address this unprecedented scale of text we're dealing with LLMs. We'll see where it leads. I'm not promising this is a pursuit that will actually yield something, but I feel like it's worth trying. It's worth going around and see what cultural AI could do, what world literature could do. There are a lot of models of different zoning of the worlds that this particular theory actually got from, like capitalist theory. And then maybe my third reflection, again, from a research perspective, is that we're undergoing this fragmentation of traditional disciplines, and we're taking some methods and tools with us, and we have to invent them. We have to invent new ones to tackle the problem of AI. And what's really happening is this increasing focus on computing, but the approaches are much broader, because we're hoping this interdisciplinarity will afford us more synthetic insights that come from working in more disciplines. And I think while we're figuring out the scope, the methods, and the terms of what we would call our work, you can see a lot of different labels for what these fields could be. I'd really encourage you to think about this initial phrase through or by employing imaginaries and evaluations and experimentations. Thank you all.
Okay, and then last up we have Danya Glabau, who's a medical anthropologist and STS scholar researching health activism, the medical economy, and how human bodies become valuable data. She directs the Science and Technology Studies minor, the Feminism and STEM minor, and the Ethics and Technology undergraduate curriculum at NYU Tandon School of Engineering. Her first book, Food Allergy Advocacy, Parenting and the Politics of Care, examined how food allergy activists get involved in scientific research and political advocacy. Her second book, Cyborg, offers a 21st century introduction to cyborg theory in contexts like work, medicine and disability, art and design, and feminist theory.
Thank you. So nice to be here. So this is a little bit of a new community for me, even though I've been following along from the sideline here at NYU for a while. I am an anthropologist. Am I the only anthropologist on the program? Okay. Oh, there's a few others. Okay, yeah, we don't use the word culture anymore because we haven't figured out how to use it non-racistly. So that's all I'll say about the word culture. In 40 years, we haven't figured it out. I am multi and interdisciplinary as well. And really speaking from my positionalities here today, primarily as a feminist STS scholar, as well as a teacher, right, and an organizer of teaching is in my role directing multiple academic programs across the river over at NYU Tandon School of Engineering. All right. So today, again, yes, I'll be speaking from my positionalities primarily as a feminist STS scholar, a teacher, and an organizer of teaching amongst my colleagues. With my talk, Feminist Science, Feminist Ethics, and AI, a view from the pedagogical ground. Since the release of ChatGPT as a consumer-facing product on November 30th, 2022, university teaching has been upended, as many of you know. Generative AI text generators like OpenAI's ChatGPT, Anthropic's Claude, and Google's Gemini came on the scene at a moment of student confusion and teacher exhaustion as pandemic restrictions lifted. Yet we were all still regularly getting sick with COVID. as well as we all perform the return to office. They feel the need for students overwhelmed by the transition and squeezed on all sides by demands on their time, attention, and money. Faculty members' attention was also elsewhere, namely on teaching basic literacy and math skills that they had missed during the pandemic. And many of us were inclined to tolerate any behaviors as long as students would just come to class. And so while much ink has already been spilled and talks given this week, I'm sure, about how these tools affect our students' career prospects, cognition, mental health, and social development, as well as how they increasingly undermine the integrity of scientific research and publishing amongst our colleagues, which we already heard a little bit about. This talk will offer up a slightly different provocation as I consider the impact of generative AI, particularly the use of LLMs on students, from the perspective of a disabled Black feminist ethics of care. This perspective sees literacy as an avenue for liberation, and care work as ceremony and necessity. And I include here in care work teaching as well as peer review, which we can maybe talk about if we want to loop back to that earlier conversation later. From a feminist perspective, institutions of higher education inhabit an ambiguous posture vis-a-vis teachers and students. They're conduits for resources and legitimizing containers for our work, but they work against feminist aims as easily as they can work for them. A disabled Black feminist ethics of care does not propose an easy answer to the question of what do we do about all of our students cheating using LLMs. The very terms of my reframing suggest how the stakes of survival and success in the so-called age of AI are not equally distributed. I aim to offer up new language for opposition to AI edtech that caring teachers can use to navigate the demoralizing moment in the history of the university. So to be clear, I am making a moral case against AI and not a practical one, right? So if you want to say, what about, or I find it useful for in your questions, take a beat and reflect on your positionality, right? This talk is also, I'll just kind of give context for this talk, not only in my role in my work, but it's also part of a larger book project provisionally called Why the Engineering School Needs Feminism, that's drawing on the past decade of my teaching and research to join a growing conversation amongst feminist science scholars who came up with feminism in the academy and still see it failing to shift or reshape the practices and ethics of scientific research. So happy to speak to that larger context if we want later as well. So I want to talk about three keywords today, and really, again, offering this as a provocation. You know, there have been talks, there have been, peer teaching, there are other kind of more concrete pieces in the works in this part of the project. But again, this is really a provocation for us to talk about today around these three keywords of literacy, autonomy, and hierarchy. And so this framing certainly echoes aspects of the concept of critical cyborg literacy developed in my recent book, Cyborg, with Laura Furlano in 2024. In fact, we just finished writing a follow-up commentary, especially talking about literacy and some extending some of the examples from this book. But in a slight departure for today, I do want to be sure to specify disabled, Black, and feminist. Literacy, autonomy, and feminist critiques of differences hierarchy are challenged by student generative AI use. And these concepts also challenge the current administrative and elite consensus about the neoliberal university that is only about producing competitive workers and competitive units of knowledge for the global, for various types of global markets. So first, literacy, and I use this word in the sense of cyborg theorists like Donna Haraway, Sheila Sandoval, and Kay Wayne Yang in the guise of La Paperson in A Third University is Possible. Literacy is a principal technology of cyborgs, as Laura and I thought about in our earlier book. Multiplicative practices of encoding and decoding ourselves into the matrix of domination strategically to survive, and also when it is time to find our lines of flight and escape. Literally reading books is our way into other worlds. As a colleague likes to say, every book we read is science fiction because it teleports us to other times, places, and subjectivities. Literacy is also a pivotal tool of Blackness. For generations of Black people in the United States, literacy was gained at the margins, after dark and undercover, on pain of retribution. And even well into the 20th century, literacy was weaponized in literacy tests at the polls that made no logical sense and only served as a tool to exclude Black people. Access to literacy continues to shape other racialized battles today about education right here in New York City, like the role of and the necessity for publicly funded but privately operated charter schools, and the educational potential of Black disabled children in disability segregated District 75 schools. We have segregated schools, segregated by disability in their own district in New York City, right? Disproportionately populated with Black students. So these are not questions that are in the past, right? And Black people in the United States have learned the hard way that literacy is a basis for modern citizenship. LLMs destroy literacy. They read to and for our students, and they do the valuable intellectual work of parsing definitions, identifying the structure of an argument, classifying and relating disparate ideas, describing how those ideas develop over time, not to mention all of the steps of outlining, writing, and revising that they take over, right? Some people, of course, argue that these tasks discretely are not writing or thinking, but I think those of us who have PhDs or on our way know that they are, right? We can no longer assign students to do an annotated bibliography because LLMs are really good at doing those. It was one of my qualifying documents for my PhD, right? So we are in a very different place. But when young people opt out of becoming literate, not only from basic reading skills, but also from learning these higher order cyborg functions of encoding, decoding, the ability to find and make meaning out of what is read, they lose the hard-fought opportunity to be a full member of society. And the adults who facilitate these shortcuts hold their pupils in an indefinitely extended form of social childhood. And so a Black, disabled, feminist ethic of care treats literacy as liberation, and it cannot stand for LLMs. Second, autonomy. And so on this point, I think with my own prior work on the interdependence of humans and machines in my book with Laura, as well as disability dreamers like Leah Lakshmi Pipsnia Samarsinya and Ashley Shue. I should also add Damien Williams here. We've been talking about his work as well in the lead up to this, one of Ashley's students. In Cyborg, drawing on Laura's autoethnographic research on using a digital insulin delivery system for type 1 diabetes, we wrote, with the system that Laura used from 2013 to 2017, her body and the multiple technological components are interdependent to create a fully functioning system. Her body benefits from the sensor's alarms and insulin delivery because they help her appropriately regulate blood glucose levels. The technological components, some of which are now AI powered, they were not in 2017, but they are increasingly or machine learning powered now. These technological components are dependent on Laura for inputs like drops of blood, charged batteries, and full insulin cartridges. Without the CGM or continuous glucose monitor technology, Laura's blood sugar could fall or rise to dangerous levels without her knowing. Without Laura's active management, the system would also cease to operate. This interdependence is a key characteristic of the intimate infrastructures that disabled cyborgs live with every day. Right, so as we suggest here, perfect autonomy is a mirage, even though that's the key word. Disabled activists and scholars emphasize that interdependence can be an opportunity for community building and care. So modern subjects live in a cyborg society where digital technologies form an important part of our, a word is missing, of our everyday lives, I think is what it was. And this makes up as well part of our active human interface with the material world, right? A quote I borrow here from Ursula K. Le Guin in her short essay, A Rant about Technology. And thus, part of the world of things we need to care for, as well as be cared by, if we wish to continue to live well in the world. Disabled people build community with and around these practices of care, even technologically facilitated care, and with other people, sometimes around that biosociality of other people who care for the same things, right? So Laura writes about how she is involved in communities of other people using the same technologies that she is, right? So not just living with type 1 diabetes, but living with type 1 diabetes using the same tools, right? So they're increasingly part of our sociality. These relationships can bring joy and creativity, right? Laura has done art installations, craft works around her experience. And those should be celebrated, even if, as they are often made necessary, these collaborations and networks are often made necessary by structural violence and by state withholding the necessary means for living. Disabled mutual aid groups also make transparent that autonomy is always available within limits because we are materially embodied. No one can fight for justice forever without food or sleep. And so because of our flesh, and keeping in mind as well the bodies of our more than human co-inhabitants of this planet, we ought to work towards a future of, as Donna Haraway puts it in Situated Knowledges, finite freedom, adequate material abundance, modest meaning and suffering, and limited happiness. Right. Here we go. But it is possible to give up too much autonomy to a tool. Ceding autonomy to a generative AI tool controlled by the American tech industry with its now apparent authoritarian impulses is dangerous. These tools are built to police, and disabled people, Black people, and feminists all have good reasons to be skeptical of the goodwill of policing. Ceding autonomy to LLMs, whose methods of knowing and making text is not even transparent to the engineers in charge of designing them, as we've heard little bits about today, multiplies the risk. Risks of harm or vulnerability are not necessarily a consequence of the material or linguistic properties of the tool per se, but they are very real in the way they are designed, controlled, marketed, and operated. And they're also difficult to assess because generative AI so effectively hides the agents in charge behind technical layers of plausible deniability. The rising interest, I would say, and technical complexity of explainability in computer science, something I hear my colleagues in the engineering school talk about frequently, should be a warning and not a salve, right? It should be a sign that it is time to stop. Whose interests are hidden when even the experts don't understand the tools that we, and especially our students, increasingly depend on? Black disabled feminist ethics of care celebrates interdependence, even at times interdependence with machines, but not a lack of autonomy. It must oppose how AI steals our students' ability to choose, opt out, and understand. And so the third keyword, hierarchy, and this one's like maybe the least worked out here, and we'll kind of segue into a couple of closing comments. Feminists oppose the use of social and biological difference to justify hierarchy. Feminist opposition to eugenics, to me, offers an exceptionally clear example in STS. For example, in Banu Subramanian's Ghost Stories for Darwin, one of my favorite things to teach, right? Positioning this as a talk coming out of teaching, as well as Donna Haraway's work on primatology. Black feminist theory has also been generative on this point. And here in particular, I'm drawing on work on the spread and integration of digital surveillance technologies that, again, make equivalent people's appearance, for example, with a moral status of a potential criminal, right? Facial recognition in law enforcement kind of does this as a standard matter of practice. So here I think with people like Simone Brown, Ruha Benjamin, Aneta Atanasovsky, and Kalindi Vora, digital surveillance and the uncritical embrace of automated devices, maybe we just call them robots, both reenact the subjugation of Black people in the United States. The first, digital surveillance, enables a continued and expanded oppression by the police. And the second, the automation of things like service work and introduces a new class of machines to non-autonomously do the work of oppressed people of color based on the false assumption that their work is unskilled or low priority, and a very strong echo of chattel slavery. Right? As an aside here, again, maybe this is a useful aside for commentary, but I'm spending the year learning how to make my own clothes. And the amount of skill that goes into like making a t-shirt is unbelievable. I cannot make a t-shirt. I can make this and I cannot make a t-shirt. And the t-shirt costs like $3 at Old Navy or H&M, right? So there, you know, there are clearly sort of built into the structure of the modern economy judgments about whose labor counts and whose labor is worthwhile. And those things are highly racialized and highly dependent on colonial systems of labor and capital. Generative AI, like many ed tech innovations before it, is often justified for classroom use because it is said to level the playing field between students with different skills, preparation, or resources. Again, these are kind of echoing the lessons that we are sort of hearing monthly in faculty meetings around this place. Furthermore, restricting the use of AI in classrooms when some large employers say they want their employees to use it on the job is also said to hold back our students from the brightest possible futures and possibly the biggest possible donations to their alma maters. This is just, again, what feminists oppose. Difference understood as hierarchy and used as a tool for further oppression. And it must be seen for what it is and opposed. We cannot be taken in by the use of students' past experiences to justify delivering them a poor education. Their pathway to liberation, their witchy lines of flight, lie through literacy and autonomy. So in A Third University is Possible, Kay Wayne Young writes about contemporary Black cinema, quote, Black assemblage involves the modding of technologies raked together by the witch's broom. He continues, the witch's flight might fashion landing pads out of first cinema, yet it is always posed to fly away from them. So let us consider what we rake together in witchy rituals of solidarity with our students in the age of AI, including what structures like the architecture and power dynamics of a classroom that we can use to get beyond critique, which is what I'm doing here again, to raising up unruly students, which is what I spend my Fridays doing with my lab. To get there, right, I would also suggest, I mean, this is a little bit less of a command than some other parts of this talk, but I would suggest that we should maybe really inhabit the role of faculty that others imagine for us. Foot dragging, recalcitrant, slow, behind the latest technological innovations, infamously out of touch, especially in the summertime. It's the only way. I see it as my moral obligation, right? And I invite you to think about how we can make 1,000, as Young calls them, third world universities out of all our classrooms and offices. So I want to end with one final quote from the historian and science fiction writer Ada Palmer that was kind of going around this week from a recent contribution to the Chronicle of Higher Education on the future of higher ed in 2026. I see someone taking a picture. You're welcome to. This is on my social media as well. I had a zine making workshop in my lab a couple weeks ago. And this was my zine. We had some fun. But let me move on to Ada Palmer's quote to wrap up here. In 2026, colleges must teach students that this is not the end of the world. We must teach hope. Current undergrads can barely remember a time before the threats of climate change and authoritarianism loomed to catastrophic scale. Despair is very emotionally tempting. It means freedom from the responsibility to shape the future. This is a terrifying turning point, but many generations before us have met such turning points, have faced such turning points and not. Only a few dozen institutions on Earth are more than 900 years old, and the vast majority are universities. The university system is not a house of straw to buckle in this storm. We are the rocks that have sheltered the knowledge, hope, and truth through tumults, which have toppled kingdoms while classrooms endured. We can endure this wave of generative AI and be a guiding light through it, but only by recentering, by teaching citizens, not workers, power, not PowerPoint, aspiration, not apocalypse. Despair is how we lose, and the classroom is where we battle it. All other battles flow from here. With that, I will end. Thank you.
Okay, I'll call our panelists back up and help them along. We've got some good time for questions here. So as they get situated, and start going around the room.
Lunch outside after this.
Hi, my question's for Nina. I got your point on thinking about language and linguistics as kind of one of these main points of coming together between literature and the goals of tech companies. Very fascinating. But I was wondering how you approach a more recent trend in text-to-speech models, which is including more non-linguistic elements like reading sounds or the tone of your voice or even laughing. Do those function very similarly to linguistics in this term? Could we think of them as almost a form of linguistics?
I love this question because it's kind of still emerging in technology. What we've seen so far is, forms of whitewashing, really, when they created, like technologists created different tools where you would get a real-time accent change, right, or reduction. So it was always going against how can we utilize this for the market. Whereas where you work in an academic setting and you're thinking about language, your whole research process is different, right? If the model creates an error, in the industry you discard it because you're going after a viable product. In an academic lab, this is what you pursue, which is why I've shown you the work we've been doing with GANs, because I think there's so much pressure we're pushing on language, especially the industry does, because it serves as the interface for everything, even for visual models, that we really need to figure out what do we actually mean by language. So I'm sure some people would agree that, yeah, there are different. We actually just talked with Emily about this yesterday. Are there different kinds of languages, like mathematical language and gestures and music and so on? I don't think about it in this way. For me, what's really interesting is this human languages that we originated, now produced in machines. How are they working? What's this other way of producing our languages through different computational means? And what's really interesting about this all is that there's been so many technical tinkering with different models of language throughout the history of computational linguistics. But there's really very few, if any, research done on what we look at language that is completely changing when you look at different model. So I have a whole project stored there, but this is a work that's way beyond me. I think many people should work on this to really figure out this question. And I think what Leaf is doing also with cognition and culture, humanism, structuralism, all of these questions is really where the humanities should look at. Like broadly, not just literary studies.
Thanks all of you for a fantastic set of talks. I really enjoyed all of them. My question is for you, Ted, because recently I've seen several attempts to theorize hallucination in LLMs as a good thing. Right? So Richard So had this recent paper on confabulation, which phrases as something that is desirable and perhaps useful. I've seen it mentioned in the context of Saadia Hartman's notion of speculative fiction, speculative fabulation, right? So like there's this tendency a bit in the humanities, the digital ones in particular, to reframe what hallucination can do for us. So I'm wondering how your idea of a historical ground truth that might, after all, not be the truth, because it comes from historical sources exclusively, as in your Mars example, positions itself vis-a-vis these notions of a revised idea of hallucination.
Yeah. Good. I think what I would say is that I'm a little bit surprised how rapidly humanists have moved back toward a view of truth that we were definitely taught in the 90s not to adopt, very definitely, which is that, that there is one and that any departure from it is hallucination, confabulation, name what you will. And one of the things I do like about the frame of culture is that it reorients us to thinking about like practices, multiple practices. There are different ways of saying anything. Sometimes it might be sufficient to say Mars is roughly 4,000 miles in diameter. You don't need the, I guess I would sort of back out. I'm not directly answering your question, but I'm answering it by saying, like, I do think we should have a lot of room for pluralism. Really, pluralism is the word. In fact, in some versions of this talk, like an earlier evolutionary ancestor of this talk, I cite that roadmap toward pluralistic alignment that came out of Yejin Choi's lab at Stanford, because I think that's really kind of the real sort of urgent social reason for doing things like benchmarks for historical and social particularity is we need AI that's capable of pluralism. And I would push much harder on that than on we need AI that's capable of being truthful. Getting human beings that are capable of being truthful is a sort of long-term project, I guess.
Thank you.
My question is for Danya. I completely agree with everything that you said about like the role of faculty and the role of the student. And I was thinking about my students from last semester and polling them about whether or not they should use LLMs, and it was like an overwhelming yes. And it just made me wonder what you think about this term digital literacy and the role of just the problem of wanting students to be citizens, but that really they just have to be workers. And so, I wonder what you think about the term digital literacy and also what you think about just including an LLM or this kind of technology as part of the practice of literacy, like a new practice of literacy that they have to kind of adjust to.
Sure. Yeah. I think the did this turn off again?
What up is on.
Yeah. All right. So I think it's on. Yes, students want to use LLMs, right? They're under a lot of pressure to use LLMs. I think part of the problem is that universities are too load bearing, especially in the United States, or in my experience in the United States, like we cannot be both somewhere where we educate citizens and somewhere where we do all of the functions of preparing students for jobs, right? You get an entry-level job at IBM in the 1960s, and you spend 6 to 12 plus months getting paid to learn that job on their campus in Westchester County, right? Like universities are suddenly doing that in addition to all of the other things that we were supposed to be doing 40 or 50 years ago. So I think universities are too load-bearing, and this is one more indication of that problem. It is up to faculty, I think, individually and in discipline-specific ways to think about how they address that. One thing, I've been having these conversations with my students as well. I typically do not allow LLM use in my courses, but I do make modifications depending on the group of students, depending on the class, depending on whether it's a required intro class versus an upper level elective, right? So in one of my classes, just a couple of weeks ago, we had a discussion. It's a small group. They're really committed. We all went through the first assignment, as far as I can tell, completed it authentically. And so for the second assignment, we talked about, well, are there places where using an LLM for certain tasks might allow you to spend more time or go in more depth on other tasks? And so we decided that yes, within kind of community agreed upon limits, that made sense for our collective purposes and performance so far. So again, I do think there's a lot of variation here, but I would say the starting point that I'm sort of clearly advocating for is to start start without them, right? Think about what skills students actually need and whether the technology is going to get into the way, rather than jumping straight to the end point of saying, but to get a job in 3 or 4 years, they need to be able to do X, Y, and Z with Claude, right? And so I think it needs to be much more discipline specific and context specific, and not get in the way of being able to read, right, or write a sentence, or pass, their first test in an intro calculus class, right, which are all things that have gone catastrophically awry, at least for us over at Tandon.
Yeah, thank you all for the great talks. I have one question for Danya and one comment for Ted. I really enjoyed the talk. I've been thinking a lot about AI as a phenomenon where it can be maybe clarifying for these kinds of political questions, right? I think if we frame AI as kind of like a wage depression device, a de-skilling device, for example, then we can point out the contradictory nature of knowledge production in universities, those kinds of things. Do you think there's opportunities that we can use where AI makes something that is normally obscured by the way power operates, that makes it more clear? And maybe answer that, and then I'll do my TED thing.
Sure. I mean, I think skill is really where I've been thinking about this a lot. So I was making proposals around curriculum in the language in terms of skill as a humanist at the engineering school, like since 2018, right? So sort of predating LLMs, and I still think that's relevant. I know that we ended with a short discussion of skill on the last panel as well. So that's still a language I think is really relevant. Discussions of de-skilling in historical terms, whether it's 18th century French silk weavers or 1950s women computers, right, in Britain, right? These are like some of the case studies that really connect with my students and get them to take seriously what they're doing. So these are conversations I think are still worth having. And I don't see the entry of LLMs into my teaching really profoundly reshaping that content. Or those approaches. It's just being very explicit, right? That here again is an example of this type of historical pattern. It is not exactly the same, right? But how can we extrapolate from the past and from the regulatory structure, the institutional structures that we've been studying, in something like an intro STS class, how can we then think about what that means for AI specifically? So, there, again, we have been under a great deal of pressure to use AI to teach, use AI to evaluate, teach how to use AI, or teach about AI in all of our classes over at Tandon, or all 4 at once. My faculty really took this very seriously, right? Those of us in the ethics and tech curriculum, undergrad ethics and tech curriculum, we've had, like 6 or 7 workshops and lunch and learns and given 2 talks collectively so far, and basically have come back to it actually doesn't fundamentally reshape our teaching any more than big data did 10 or 12 years ago, right? It's still the same questions and maybe we prompt students to give contemporary answers to them, but it has not actually remade our teaching. Our assignment structures, but sort of it does not undermine the larger disciplinary picture for us. It's 3 years of discussion about this as well.
Ted, because you brought up Yejin Choi's lab, I just wanted to tell you a quick anecdote, which is in 2021, I believe, about a year before ChatGPT, they released this morality bot Delphi, where you could put in 2 situations and it would tell you which one is more ethical or whatever. And, of course, immediately, the moment it came out, we put in what happens when you put in like man and white man, and it's like white man is more ethical than black man, etc. So we emailed them, and we were like, maybe you shouldn't do it as a research paper, but maybe don't make it into an open demo. And they didn't want to. So we wrote a critique of that paper, and primarily we focused on the fact that they treated ethics as a benchmarkable project that you could benchmark in the same way that you could benchmark like natural language inferences, where there is an objective ground truth. Right. And the fun fact that I wanted to tell you about that is that paper that we wrote has been cited dozens and dozens of times. And you know what the NLP community always cites that paper for? It always cites the paper for different cultures have different values.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I just want to note about the university that I think that a strange thing has happened where you see an enormous amount of bureaucratic inertia over years. Like there's a slow trend line to that inversion where like 70% of US faculty were tenured in around 1970, and now it's inverted, right, to about 30%. That's all been very slow. And it seems that the bureaucratic inertia, I thought it was going to pick up small language departments, et cetera, this year. It didn't. I'm not sure that it will anymore, although it might. I have no idea. The inertia is enormous. So the formal situation of the education is basically the same at a bureaucratic level. But I think that the model has been really subsumed into like enormous pressure to act in a certain way that we have to take account of and we have to be realistic about, in the sense that the pipeline that the students go through is feeding them into a particular kind of economy and a particular distribution within that economy that shapes what kind of behaviors they need to do cognitively, right? At the same time, and for some reason this is a terrible mismatch, the 30% of people, let alone the people who don't get this, the 30% of people in those teaching roles who do get into the tenure pipeline are shaped in an extremely similar way because they are put under enormous pressure, right, in order to get to the other side of that. So, and then they become like, reactionary structurally because they are aligned with that sort of like slow bureaucratic bleed that is happening. Nothing has really changed that picture for me in the time that I've been at NYU, let alone, I just don't see that it's changed in the last since the very first diagnoses of postmodernism came out, basically, right? That's sort of the structural condition that we're in. I have a question. If you want to comment on that, Danya, I would love to hear it, but I also have a question for Ted, which is like about context versus culture. I understand what you're getting at, but I want to know in those cultures that you're talking about, not everything is textual, of course, and that's definitely true. So you can't literally write it down as text in certain cases, but you do have interpretant chains in all of those cultural activities that can be recorded in one way or another. I think the notion of writing, you were talking about like, suddenly we're back in ground truth. I do feel like we're fishing back out, and I'm doing it, and you're doing it, and other people are doing it. We're fishing back out this notion of sort of general writing, structural writing, theory as something that has to do with text. But I worry that with multimodal models and with robotics, that we're going to miss the fact that writing is much bigger than text. And it really comes down to registration of any kind. So datafication of any kind. And if you are able, and I don't know if this is possible, but we seem to be on the verge of testing whether it's possible to do the level of very broad generalization that happens in LLMs across a wide variety of a wide variety of types of data. And then I worry that your culture context distinction will start to collapse, or it will start to converge in a way where it'll be much harder to hold those things apart.
So I would say no, but although I agree with you that it's important that AI is not limited to writing. Multimodal is super important, going to get more important. I focus on writing only because that happens to be what we in this benchmark, in this one project, that's what we are concretely interested in. But the general principle that I want to advocate is not like AI is only about writing, but we should be concrete about what we're using the word culture to really mean. In some cases, that might be images or speech sounds recorded on poetry, people coughing. We can model that thing. I don't know if we want to call coughing culture, but we can model it. I think the reason why I want to make that, I want to hesitate don't want to sort of forbid use of the word culture, but get us to hesitate a little bit about it or think about it, is more that tension between the countable and uncountable senses, which would apply possibly even to coughing, you know? Yeah.
I just want to say that the Gopnik group, who Henry is now representing alone since Cosma had to leave. But like what Allison did with that paper is to take this notion of culture that comes out of EvoPsych from the 80s and especially the 90s. Like it's a Merlin Donald notion, as far as I'm concerned. It's like, and then you get versions of it in Sperber and other places like that. But like that notion of culture is anything that can be transmitted generation to generation, peer to peer among humans, right? And I think that's the relevant notion of culture. I have some quibbles, but they're very small compared to somehow, I agree with you. I think somewhere along the line, literary theory got very confused about the notion of culture. First by basically saying, we're not going to do it racistly, right?
Which is hard. Right?
Yeah, but we're not anthropologists, so it's less hard because we can just decide not to say anything, right, if we want to. So, but then like Cogsci and EvoPsych came up around the other corner with it in this way that has like a pretty broad and compelling notion, which is like, it does separate us in certain ways, not entirely, from animals, at least in levels of complexity, at least in regimes of signs, types of regimes of signs. And I don't know where the limit is personally on where that can become data.
I guess in a sense, I would say I'm fine with the word culture as long as we're able to communicate to NLP and CS that math is culture. And if the definition of culture is that broad, then the word is useful, but that's not how it's typically being used.
If I teach culture in my classes, it's through a Helen Mirren article about teaching math in, I think in Sierra Leone, and the different ways that you teach counting, right, outside of the West, right? So counting is not universal. It's not. But I also wanted to, I want to address your question as well. So your tenured faculty here? Yeah, so about a third of our faculty at NYU are non-tenure track teaching faculty. Right? We're part of a union called Contract Faculty United. I think a little bit less than a third are tenured and tenure track faculty if we're going by seats and hours of instruction, and a little bit more than a third are adjuncts, right? And I often have conversations with my contract faculty colleagues that because we are lightly to not at all evaluated on our research output, we are collectively realizing we can do much more creative and radical research because it is institutionally undervalued and illegible. Right, the year that my second book in 2 years came out, I was evaluated lower on my yearly evaluation than I had been the previous year, right? And you think about that, humanist, how much work goes into a book, right? And it's just indicative of the fact that scholarly production is nearly invisible for the institution. That's also an opportunity, right? And I've been working with colleagues this year exploring what that opportunity is concretely in terms of what can we make, right? How can we teach informed by our practices and our scholarly production if that's basically a black hole for evaluation. So that's one, it's not entirely not an opportunity, the way that NYU has pursued the relative reduction of tenured and tenure track faculty.
Last question.
Hello, everyone. I'm Shudi Manshuke. This is a really interesting conference, right? So I wanted to comment on the Black feminist or the Black ethics of the Black, So my background, studied PhD at Cornell University. I'm on the African history and archaeology. Before that, MBA in a few areas, financial management, and business, and economics. Also, I have a security background as well. I'm also Nigerian, who's been here forever. And the disturbing thing, I find LLM to be like a raw opportunity for to be able to, especially for people in the Black, African diaspora. That's the term I like to use, not Black. So Black, up until very recently, Black is more African American, period. It's not really Afro-Latina, Afro-Latinos, African, Indigenous, Black, right? So let's say African American diaspora, which will include Indigenous people, because most Africans are Indigenous, right? So the disturbing thing about LLM is that you have a word that's very colonized. The word that has very colonized, imperialistic, right? Western colonization, right? So a lot of the people that are writing about these things, or the thought leaders, at least in the part of the world that people look at the most, the West, are very monoculture. Okay, so growing up, culture is people's way of life, which includes language, religion, dance, food, we're about to eat today, like the way they dress, and the idea that you value everyone. None is better than the other, but you value and respect everyone, knowing that, guess what? I don't know that culture. I should ask, seeking expertise from the person from that culture to explain it to me. So you have a very monolistic conversation going on that would kind of like simplifying this culture. So when you say the Black way or the Black, feminine Black ethics, it's a very plain way or describing a very, very, very complex culture, especially when we move into the Indigenous people, African diaspora. The other thing is that the argument about making sure that you learn the basics, right? I'm telling you for that argument, as an educator for the argument. Learning the basics, and that includes really for everybody in the lower field, art education, reading with your hands, making things, coloring, painting, which a lot of people in the US are missing a lot of gaps, especially if you're from low income areas, right? So when you have those skill sets, which actually a lot of African diaspora and Indigenous people have, is actually a huge, huge advantage when learning AI or LLM. When you have that skill set, you can really go. As a Nigerian, people in that part of the world are really good at programming, math, capitalistic economics. Why? Because they value all that parts of you. And the fact, at least for me, growing up a time ago, they still have those things now that one day out of the school, every child must do a task. Whether it's like crocheting or painting or cooking or woodworking for the boys or raffia, you have to do something one day of the week. You attend whatever the marks or religion for maybe 1 or 2 hours, and after that, for the rest of the day, you have to do something. So that's a huge advantage. So yes, once you have those basic of creative skills, add that to LM, it's actually what I call the AI could actually close the gap, bridge the gap of colonization, if we look at it comprehensively that way.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to think about that and listen to it. Thank you so much. Let's talk more.
Shall we get lunch?
Thank you.